"Andrew, which do you like better, white or pink?" Caroline asked, lying on the big bed with her phone in her hands. She'd been looking for a wedding bouquet for a week, and she couldn't decide. "I like both," Andrew replied politely but without much interest, barely glancing at the photo. "Why is it so difficult?" she questioned, feigning anguish. "I'll order any of them." "Why does it even matter?" Chuckling, the groom asked, switching off the lamp. "You don't understand. Everything has to be perfect." Caroline gave him a surprised look and continued her search. 6 months had passed since Andrew had proposed to her, and there wasn't a day that went by that Caroline didn't talk about the upcoming wedding. She was endlessly booking and choosing things, consulting with her friends. Everything else seemed to have lost its importance to her. Andrew, on the contrary, was rather annoyed by the endless preparations. He tried to stay away and observe what was happening as an outside spectator, and then on the day of the wedding to participate in the prepared event as an actor in the play. "Andrew," Caroline said, "you're not helping at all," complained his mum. "Mum, don't you start. Someone has to pay for this whole extravaganza." "Well, that's me. In case you've forgotten, I work, and I don't care what color the cake is or what they serve it in." The son brushed it off. He did work hard, even though his parents were well-to-do people, but the only thing he owed them was a good education. They never spared any money for it. However, having received his diploma, the son never once asked for help. On the contrary, he tried to help himself. Now, when he was to start a family, Andrew felt even more responsibility. The bride was used to luxury. Her father and mother raised her like a princess. She got everything she wanted, from expensive clothes to trips abroad. After marriage, she will hardly want to limit herself in anything. Parents on both sides, who once had introduced the young people, were very pleased with this union. Both are handsome, with serious education, ambitions, business. What else do their mums need? In fact, they couldn't stand each other. They carefully pretended friendship, exchanged recipes, praised their children, and pestered their husbands with gossip about each other. Fathers took things much easier. When they met, they discussed business and the latest news. "No, but did you see the dress she was wearing today? 50 years old, and she still looks like a girl." Mrs. Ann Pete was outraged after a family evening with her parents and Caroline. "Oh, come on, really. Whatever she wants to wear, she wears," in one attempt to shut the subject down, her husband grudgingly replied. With the wedding a week away, all the women lost their peace. Caroline worried about her jewelry. The mums were busy revising the festive menu. Andrew stayed late at work every day just to avoid talking about the upcoming festivities. Of course, he couldn't do that because everyone was looking to him for advice, or at least approval. Another unpleasant conversation took place with his mother right before the celebration. "Andrew," she turned to her son as he sat on the sofa in her living room. What he asked nonchalantly, leaning back against the large, soft backrest. "You don't like these wedding preparations after all," she said condescendingly. "Have mercy," Andrew replied jokingly. "It's been months now, with no end in sight. Yes, I'd give anything to make this day go by as quickly as possible." "Okay, you're kidding. I can see Caroline's worried. She's trying. You don't seem very happy about it." Mrs. Ann Pete looked at her son warily and continued. "Are you still in pain over that iris of yours?" "I told you not to talk about it," Andrew said sternly. "And if that's why you called me here, I'd better go." "Come on, why are you so quick?" "I was just asking. I want you to be happy." But Andrew wasn't convinced by the last words. He packed up and soon left for home. "You are nervous after all," said Mrs. Ann Pete, looking out of the window as the car drove out of the gate. "Well, what a thing. You still haven't forgotten." At last the long-awaited day came. A whole team came to see them in the morning: photographer, makeup artist, hairdresser. The morning of the bride photo shoot went perfectly. Caroline was satisfied and immediately went on business. Andrew stayed at home, realizing that the first photo shoot was enough for him. They arrived at the registry office in different cars. The groom, in a beautiful blue suit with a butterfly and a white flower in his buttonhole, waited for the bride with the guests at the entrance to the building. A large white limousine pulled up. Andrew opened the door and offered his hand to his beautiful bride. The crowd applauded with admiration. Caroline was truly beautiful in a lush cream dress with open shoulders and elegantly styled hair. The delicate makeup, earrings and necklace around her neck shone in the summer sunshine. Andrew handed her a bouquet of delicate pink flowers that he had managed to pick up from the shop on his way out. Then the whole procession moved inside. Snow-white columns, a staircase, golden banisters covered with a red carpet, crystal chandeliers under the ceiling. It was a real old palace. Caroline really wanted the registration to take place here. When the couple entered the hall, The mums couldn't help but admire the children. Mrs. Ann Pete even folded her arms across her chest and cried. Such a sweet and touching moment. At the words of the wedding registrar about love and fidelity, cried all the women present. After the exchange of rings, kisses, bouquets, hugs, and photo session, the newlyweds and guests went to the embankment, where on one side there was a well-maintained green park, and on the other, sparkling water. The photos here turned out just great. While the guests drank champagne and admired the views, the newlyweds and the photographer went aside to a white gazebo to take some beautiful shots. Caroline posed contentedly. Andrew tried to play along, but wished to himself that it would all be over soon. They stepped back to a bench with a huge flowering bush towering over it. The bride's bouquet, which its owner had so carefully chosen, remained lying on the side of the arbor. Suddenly a boy appeared from behind the trees. He ran up, grabbed the flowers, and rushed across the path into the thickest bushes. Before everyone realized what was happening, the boy had disappeared. Andrew saw his wife's confused face, ready to cry. After all, she had been preparing for this day for so long, and everything should have gone perfectly. And now this. Well, I'll catch up with him and bring him back in 5 minutes. He calmed his fiancée and quickly went in the direction where half a minute ago the boy disappeared. That's odd. He didn't look like a street kid, dressed normally, like all teenagers, hair and hands clean. He didn't look like he came from a wealthy family, but he wasn't poor either. But why did he need someone else's wedding bouquet? The boy ran down the street, holding the flowers to his chest. Whether he realized that he was being chased was unclear. He was in a hurry, moving along the edge of the footpath, so that cyclists and passers-by wouldn't get in his way. Mums with prams, schoolchildren, grandmothers, many turned round, watching the strange sight of a man in a groom's suit running after a child with flowers in his hands. Finally, Andrew stopped and wanted to turn back. To hell with this bouquet, he thought. I'll say that the boy got lost in the crowd or threw the flowers into the water, but for some reason his feet wouldn't go there. It's still only noon. Ahead awaits a feast. Congratulations, gifts, dancing. Frankly speaking, this holiday of life bored him very much. Andrew looked in the direction of the street, where the thief had run away, and after thinking for a couple of seconds, he hurried after him again. The boy turned into the courtyard, slowed down to catch his breath, and wandered past the houses. At one of the playgrounds, he was called by the boys. Look, here comes Andrew. Hey, why are you alone? And without your grandmother? Mockingly asked a tall guy sitting on a small rusty merry-go-round. The other boys laughed. Leave me alone, muttered the boy and walked quickly past with his head down. What have you got there, flowers? Give them to me. I'll give them to Susie. The boy stood up and followed. The boy ran away, apparently afraid that the stolen bouquet would be taken away. What the hell is going on here? Andrew was puzzled as he watched the scene, and seeing that the boys had already approached the boy, he hurried towards them. He called out to the group. The hooligans looked round. Can't you buy flowers for a girl? You just have to hit on the kid. None of your business. The boy took offense. Andrew followed the boy, who managed to slip away and headed further into the courtyards behind the high-rise building to a small stone house. Judging by the windows, there were 2 or 3 flats on the first floor. Here the bridegroom, for the second time, thought that it was necessary to return. Well, the street kid stole the bouquet. Maybe he wants to sell it or give it to the grandmother, who had just been mentioned by the kids on the playground. It's a simple matter of going to the nearest florist and buying something acceptable. Caroline and her guests are probably already fidgeting, not realizing where he's gone, and as luck would have it, the phone was left in the car. We have to leave for the restaurant in 20 minutes, but something was still keeping me from turning round and heading back. Better call a taxi right away. But interest took over. Had he run across the street to get here for nothing? Andrew in his fancy suit looked strange and unnatural amidst the poverty and ruin that surrounded him. Strange. He'd run through these parts a few times, but he didn't even know what these old courtyards harbored. The walls of the house had crumbled away. A large black spot gaped under the roof, as if something had hit the surface hard, but hadn't made a hole, only exposed the insides. Several of the windows were missing panes. Behind them one could see empty rooms with peeling wallpaper. The porch steps were nearly collapsed. The wooden door hung on a single hinge. Inside the building, Andrew was surrounded by the smell of a long unventilated cellar, damp and musty. Shabby green walls, dirty staircases. The house seemed abandoned and living out its last days. A voice was heard upstairs. Andrew headed there cautiously, stepping slowly, afraid of falling through. "Why did you steal the bouquet?" he asked. The voice sounded strange amidst the silence. Andrew entered the flat, and the first thing that caught his eye was the old woman sitting by the window and the boy hiding in the corner behind a huge cupboard. "I'll give it to my mom," he answered timidly, not expecting a chase. The thief was frightened when his grandmother told him that a man had come for him. "I'll dry the roses and give them to her when she comes back." Andrew looked at the woman. She guessed the question. "She's in the colony," the woman answered indifferently. "And this is my grandson, Andrew. Why are you taking someone else's? Give me back the flowers." She turned to the boy, and he looked at the guest in confusion, who at that moment was less interested in the ill-fated bouquet. He went to the shelf and looked at the photograph. "Is this your daughter?" he asked in surprise. "Yes," she answered indifferently, as if being in a stranger's house did not embarrass her at all. "And she is the one who is now in the colony?" Andrew continued, puzzled. "You're getting married today, aren't you?" asked the landlady. "A wedding." The groom thought about it for half a minute. "Oh yes, a wedding. What happened to Iris? Did something happen at work?" "She was framed," I guess the woman said reluctantly. "We didn't have money for a lawyer, and the boss was very important." The woman and her grandson watched the strange stranger, who stepped back to the door, confused. Then he turned round, mumbled something, looked at the boy, which made him frightened again, and clutched the bouquet more tightly to his chest. "Andrew, give the flowers back, I beg you. We'll pick lilacs later when we go to meet her," interrupted the awkward moment. "No, leave them." The guest got upset. "How old are you?" "6," answered the boy timidly. "I see," Andrew replied hurriedly. "Deciding to think about it later, I have to go now, but can I come back?" The grandmother and grandson looked at each other. "Did you know her?" the woman asked, waving at the framed photograph. Andrew nodded back. "Come on in, we're almost always here. Andrew won't be going to school until next year." The journey back took no more than 4 minutes. Sitting in the taxi, Andrew couldn't see any streets or stops. He looked at his own reflection in the side mirror and remembered how he had once stood under the windows of a student dormitory with a huge bouquet of white roses. A small, fragile girl who seemed to him the most beautiful in the world had come out to him. "Is it for me?" She looked happily at the flowers. Yes, Andrew came to his senses. They stood there under the curious stares from the windows, in the light rain, but they could not part, and then he went to study abroad, and they were lost. "Where have you been so long, and where is the bouquet?" Caroline interrupted him abruptly. She was seething with indignation. They hadn't finished the photo shoot, but they needed to leave for the restaurant already. The flowers were gone, and he hadn't even thought to buy other ones. The only thing stopping her from making a scene was the faces of the guests around her. The boy ran off and hid somewhere. "I haven't found him," her husband answered her absent-mindedly. "Are you out of your mind?" Caroline hissed with anger. "You've been gone for half an hour." Hooah, Caroline. "It's all right. Daddy and I will go and get another bouquet. In the meantime, you two go to the restaurant." Her mother tried to calm her down. "But why should you miss the gala now?" The daughter continued to be upset. "It's okay. We won't be long," assured the parents and went to the car. The bride's day was ruined. She had thought of everything so carefully, tried so hard, and now some stupidity had ruined it. All the resentment was directed not at the boy who had stolen the flowers for some reason, but at her husband, who had done such a stupid thing. And now he's standing in front of her with such an indifferent look, as if it's nothing to do with him at all. "What's the matter with you?" she whispered to him when everyone had dispersed, and the newlyweds were at a separate, beautifully decorated table. "I'm fine. You know how I get tired of such events," he lied. At some point, the banquet moved from the building to the street, or rather, to the cozy, spacious courtyard of the restaurant. Andrew didn't notice as Caroline changed her dress to a more comfortable outfit. She posed for pictures, smiling naively, hugging her parents and friends. She laughed. She asked for more champagne, but never stopped glancing at her husband. The whole show was played for the guests. A heavy feeling grew inside that something was wrong. Yes, Andrew had allowed himself to tease her about her preparations, and he hadn't taken much initiative, but tonight he was too aloof. Dusk descended on the city. The evening chill had taken hold. The lights came on. The guests scattered around the grounds. Some were chatting at tables, some were dancing. Some were swinging on the big swings. Ahead of them still waited a huge cake, which the newlyweds had to cut together. Then tea, dancing, Bengal lights, and the final joint photos. Caroline stepped away from her mom and dad and looked around absent-mindedly. Andrew was nowhere to be found. Pretending to walk from one guest to another, Caroline tried to figure out where her husband had gone. He was standing on a small terrace overlooking the river, leaning on the parapet. "It's beautiful," he said without looking at the girl. The city was glowing below, the red sunset and streetlights reflected in the water. "Yes," Caroline answered automatically. "Let's go see the guests." He was upset for some reason and looked at her with an annoyed look. "So let's go," deciding to deal with it later. Caroline smiled again. The rest of the evening went beautifully. Beautiful music, a gorgeous white and red cake that everyone was smitten with, a spectacular ending to the event, a photo together. But as soon as the guests left, there was silence. The holiday was abruptly switched off. Music sounded. From the half-open window came the noise of the city, but there was a heavy silence between them. Caroline took offense at the incident of the day. Andrew, on the other hand, saw the boy hiding behind the cupboard in front of his eyes. After a week, things got better. Work, everyday life, visits. In the hustle and bustle of everyday life, the thoughts dissipated. Spoiled holiday seemed not so bad now, especially since friends, relatives, and colleagues were satisfied. At the weekend, she had a chance to visit the house that had been on her mind. Caroline decided to organize a meeting with her friends in the countryside in some new fashionable salon. Andrew was happy to approve of the idea. He had about 5 hours to drive to and back from the house. He caught Andrew in the yard trying to ride a small bicycle without pedals. The neighborhood was empty. The playground was overgrown with grass, the paths were cracked, and the wall of a large unfinished house blocked the place from other yards. Andrew looked around. It was depressing and eerie to see a child in a wasteland of old, dilapidated buildings. He greeted the boy cheerfully. "What's wrong with your bike?" "It's falling apart," he answered shortly and clearly. And then he was shy, apparently having decided that he had said it too boldly. "It's no good," Andrew sighed. "Drop it and let's see what I've brought you." The boy's eyes lit up, but then he remembered his fear again and stood still. "What are you doing? Take the present as soon as you can." "Is it for me forever?" Andrew asked incredulously. "Forever," nodded. "I'll leave it here. I'll go to your grandmother's house." Andrew went into the entrance and watched from the dirty window as the boy hesitated, looked in the direction of the house, and rushed to unseal the box. Inside was a big blue machine with a remote control. If anyone knew what a child who had received no more than a couple of presents in his 6 years felt at that moment, they would understand. It was a real feeling of happiness. Andrew watched the picture in the yard with a satisfied look and went upstairs. Grandma opened the door, inviting him inside. The room felt cleaner. The same wedding bouquet still stood in a vase on the window. "She won't let me throw it away," Granny explained. They met. Her name was Mrs. Mia. She had lived in the house for 40 years. But now it had been declared an emergency and she and her grandson would soon be moving out. But so far there was no news, and they, along with a few neighbors, stayed there. "Of course, I realize that it's getting dangerous here, and Andrew will have to go to school. His classmates will laugh at him for living in a barracks. But I'm so attached to this house in my heart. My husband and I lived here, and Iris was born here," said the woman, looking round the walls that were dear to her heart. "How's she writing?" Andrew took a moment to ask her. "Yes, she sends a letter once a month. We read it together with my grandson, and then we write back." "Who's his father?" "I don't know. Someone looked after my daughter, came with flowers and gifts, but she never told me. And then Andrew turned up when she was locked up, and it was just the two of us." Iris looked noticeably older than her years, and Andrew was very much like his mother. Andrew suddenly pictured her here, standing by the window or dusting the bookshelves. It made his chest feel uncomfortable. "Bah, look," little Andrew said quite contentedly as he entered. He was still shy of the guest, but his joy was overflowing. When he saw the table full of goodies, he became even more animated, and in half an hour there was not a trace of embarrassment left. As he walked out, Andrew felt a cozy warmth spread through his body. Strangely, this old house with its empty windows gaping in the evening light no longer seemed to be a haven for alcoholics and homeless people. Even a place like this, it turned out, could be more pleasant to be in than his stylish flat with its whitewashed ceiling, which still smelled pleasantly new. He patted his hand lightly on his trouser pocket, where a small bag contained a few blonde hairs he had discreetly removed from his comb. Waiting for the test results had taken several agonizing days. The moment he was handed the envelope seemed to turn everything in his life upside down. "Oh, my son, look at that." "Andrew, look. Do you like it?" A voice broke into his musings. Caroline was standing in front of him with an open sketchbook with several kitchen designs in it. "What?" he asked, uncomprehending. "Look, do you like this one?" The girl pointed her finger at one of the pictures. I don't care. Choose it yourself without looking, replied her husband. You don't care? I don't understand. Andrew, what's going on? Are we living together or what? Caroline was indignant. I don't care about the kitchen right now, especially since you're going to do what you like anyway. She snorted resentfully and walked away. Andrew was glad of that, though. He really didn't care about the household chores in the flat or his wife's outfits. He was not ready to discuss the matter with her, imagining her reaction in advance. Traveling to see his son became a regular occurrence, but he did not yet know how to start a conversation about their kinship. In the autumn, Andrew decided to go to the colony to Iris, not even knowing why he would do it or what he would do afterwards. He was determined to find her. According to Mrs. Mia's story, she had another 6 months to serve. The prison building was in a neighboring town. The gray and gloomy red brick building had no windows on the outside and was surrounded by a high stone fence with barbed wire on top. Andrew was let through the checkpoint and escorted to the warden's office. I was told you were here to see Miss Iris Smith. A stout, older man in uniform asked him. Yes, may I see her? No, unfortunately, the man said. Why? Andrew asked confidently, ready to use his money and all his assertiveness, but the answer stunned him. Well, she died of tuberculosis. She's buried here in our cemetery, but I can't let you in. Only relatives and no non-relatives. That's it, he was talking to himself, sitting on a chair and hearing everything through a veil of confusion and incomprehension. How did she die? He said at last. And so the chief said nervously, like all people die. So she. And who are you to her? She only has a sick mother and a son, I think. You know so much about prisoners' families, the visitor asked without losing his senses. Well, I have to. It's my job, he explained with a wave of his hands. But he couldn't tell Mrs. Mia and Andrew what had happened. The boy waited for his mum so much, kept in his locker all the gifts prepared for her in the form of cards, sweets, and dried flowers. It would be cruel to announce her death to him. But withholding it wasn't the best idea either. All in all, this difficult moment had been postponed and postponed. Caroline became nervous, getting worked up over anything, whether it was things left in the wrong place or a missed phone call. Several times her husband was ready to tell her what was going on in his life. But for some reason, each time she started talking about money, fashion, her friends' personal lives, and the desire disappeared. Andrew was completely sure that she wouldn't understand him. Moreover, all this would make her very jealous. Mrs. Mia had been ill for a long time and had already got used to her condition. But now she was not well at all. When Andrew arrived, he found his son at his first-floor neighbor's house. The grandmother was taken to the hospital. When he arrived and entered her room, he immediately noticed how much she had changed. A thin, pale face, trembling hands. The nurse had warned him that the patient was too weak to talk. But seeing how pleased she was, she let him stay and left. What is it, Mrs. Mia? Andrew asked affectionately. I wanted to see my grandson off to first grade, but I guess I won't have time, she said. You will. You'll make it. Just lie here and get better. Andrew, before I forget, I need to talk to you now before it's too late. What about? I know you're here for a reason. Yeah, you're right. Andrew wasn't ready for this conversation and was frantically searching for words. Is he your son? The woman guessed. Yes, he is, Andrew sighed. So well, that's good. Don't leave him, please, when I'm gone. What are you talking about? It'll be all right. Promise, Mrs. Mia insisted. I promise, he gave in. They hugged goodbye and Andrew left, determined to return again as soon as work allowed. But that was the last time they would see each other, because a couple of days later, the hospital called with news of his grandmother's death. Little Andrew was confused when he learned that his grandmother was gone. It was the second scariest day of his life after his mum was taken away by uniformed men. He ran back to his room, climbed onto the sofa, and curled up in a corner. His father sat beside him, wondering if he should tell him now about something that should have been done a long time ago. Andrew, I know how hard this is for you, he began and heard the boy sobbing softly. But there's something I have to tell you. Do you understand? I'm not a stranger to you. I guessed it a long time ago, continued crying. The boy answered. You did? I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. I was afraid. In case you didn't want to talk to me. Andrew stood up and looked at his father with red, crying eyes. Can I give you a hug? Andrew sir asked. The boy nodded. He hugged his son for the first time and felt him cling tightly to him. He shuddered. breathing deeply, clutching at his father's coat. Something had to be done right away. "I can't take you away right now." Andrew struggled to speak, and then he felt little hands gripping the edges of his clothes tighter. "But it's only temporary. I'll do the paperwork and pick you up right away, okay?" It was unbearably sad to leave him. Of course, it wasn't the paperwork, it was Caroline, who had to be prepared. At least the neighbor was a good woman who had known the boy since he was a baby. Andrew involved several lawyers he knew in his case to solve everything as soon as possible and without sending the child to an orphanage. They assured him that the case would be resolved as necessary. There are no other relatives. No one to claim custody, as long as the wife's okay with it. The wife is the hardest part of the case. Talking to Caroline, she got home and went straight to the bathroom to relax after a day of work. Once out, she started her own tradition of a grooming routine, and somewhere between massaging her face and applying cream to her heels, the sky above her head opened up and a terrible thunderclap erupted. "Is that where you keep going? Now I get it. Now I understand everything," she said, pacing around the flat in her dressing gown and a towel on her head. "Caroline, please sit down and calm down. The baby was here long before you and I met." Andrew tried to calm her down. "How could I believe you? How could I? How could I be so stupid? Not to see anything," she continued. It had been a very difficult evening, but it was over. Caroline even outwardly accepted the fact that her husband hadn't cheated on her and had a son, the consequences of his past life. Custody had been arranged. Andrew Jr. came home, was given a large room, and the boy had his own spacious bed, shelves of toys, a modern phone, a whole wardrobe of clothes, and a real new bike with whole pedals and bell for the first time. His former friends from the neighboring yard would never have recognized him. Everything would be fine if it weren't for his stepmother, who disliked the child as soon as he stepped over the threshold of the zoo. Andrew saw had found him a nanny, and Caroline didn't have a single new chore. But when her husband was late, she was alone with his son. "Get out," she would squeamishly address Andrew whenever she found him in the corridor or the kitchen, "and don't touch anything." His father, on the other hand, loved him dearly. He enrolled him in school prep courses, taught him to ride a bike and rollerblade. The boy never told anyone about his stepmother humiliating him every chance she got. One day, Caroline came home from a meeting with a friend, staggered, took off her heels, and threw them away with a loud thud. Hearing the knock, Andrew rushed to his room, having forgotten the sweets on the coffee table in front of the TV. "You bastard, you've been sketching. Clean it up," she shouted, dropping the biscuits to the floor, where they crumbled into small pieces. The boy didn't react. "Clean it up, or you're out the door," she shouted. "I won't." "You're the one who dropped it," Andrew replied. "Is that any way to talk to me?" "Oh yes, there's no one else to teach you. Your mom's dead." "That's a shame. There'd be somewhere to escort you out of here." The boy ran into the hallway, grabbed his jacket and hat, put on his boots and ran outside. Caroline wasn't going to follow him. She smirked and headed to the bathroom to lie in the warm water. When Andrew saw returned, he found her asleep in that very same bathtub. Her son was nowhere to be found. "He's so clueless. You can't expect anything good from him. Probably ran off somewhere," Caroline shrugged. It was evening and then night before there was any news of Andrew. The boy decided to drive back to his place. Andrew got on a bus, got the wrong number, and drove out of town. Getting off at one of the stops, he wandered among the streets until he was met by an elderly man in a green suit, similar to those worn by hunters or fishermen. The man sheltered him in his hut on the very outskirts. He began to watch the adverts. His intuition didn't fail him. The child was already wanted. When Andrew entered the wooden cabin, it was warm inside, and the wood in the cooker was crackling quietly. A brown dog's head was visible in a box under the table. Somewhere a radio was working. Andrew was asleep on the sofa, covered by a large jacket. When he saw his daddy, he was very happy, because his childhood imagination had already painted a picture that he had lost him forever. The owner of the house, who looked like a hermit, invited everyone to the table. While they were drinking tea, he told them how he had met the boy and how he had found himself in his hut. "I was walking the dog. I've only recently got a dog, but I still need to walk it. There's no one on the streets." And there he was, Andrew, wandering around. "I told him not to go out at night, and at night, there's no chance of a beast coming out. And he's crying." The owner was a nice, simple man. He used to work in a hospital, but after his wife died, he lost interest in everything and decided to buy himself a cottage to live in peace and quiet. "Well, Andrew, don't run away again." He shook the boy's hand in a mature way, and he shook his head. In his hands he held a small chubby lump. There were 6 of them sleeping in that box under the table. They had already learned to run and eat on their own. 4 of them were going to be taken away by the residents of the nearest houses in the private sector. The owner decided to keep one for himself, and the last one, the smallest and cutest, it was unknown whether it would survive or not. I found Lucy already pregnant. The vet said to me, "Let's do everything now. There will be no puppies," and I didn't want to. "Let them be born, I'll give them to neighboring houses." And then only 1 week one came out. "Comrade, do you want to take him?" "Yes," the boy said confidently. "Well done. You have a good boy," he said to Andrew Sr. When everyone had gone outside, the owner continued, "Ah, my son has no conscience. That's the kind of man he is. And that's not the way his mother and I raised him," continued the hermit. "What colony?" Andrew asked, remembering his recent trip. "It's not far away. And you know what I learned about him?" I was disgusted. "I guess it's a good thing my mother didn't live to see such a disgrace." The hermit shared his worries. "Some woman he pretended to be dead and lives with her. He fell in love. They say with no memory. I don't know whether it was of her own free will or not, but I wanted to go to the right place, but I didn't dare. Besides, it's my son." Andrew Jr. was already in the car, stroking the puppy in his lap. He waved goodbye to his rescuer, and he and his father went home. This time the son told everything. Knowing Caroline's temper, Andrew had no doubt that she had indeed bullied the child in his absence. A Palato says, and let's forget the story, he tried to resolve the situation. "What?" The wife was outraged. "Do I have to apologize for that? I didn't expect that from you, Andrew." "Then you'll have to live apart for a while. I'll get you a flat," he responded calmly. It was a tactic he'd thought of as he drove around the city streets. Then Caroline's patience ran out. She confronted him about it, accused him of lying. "Traitor," she said, and that she wouldn't stand for it. As she packed her bags, she still hoped her husband would stop her, but it was as if he had been waiting for it. She slammed the door, throwing the shared photos off the shelves and leaving a mess behind. Her parents, who knew nothing about what had been going on in their daughter's family lately, were shocked. From her stories, it seemed that Andrew had cheated on her, and then brought a child to the flat in Brooklyn, unknown where he came from his frivolous friend. But little Andrew was doing better than ever. He studied and played, ran around the flat with a puppy, which together with the nanny they organized a special corner. With all their efforts, the little boy had grown stronger and could already go out on his own. Caroline could not calm down. She was sure that her husband was just confused, and her task was to help him. She went to his parents for protection and support. What Mrs. Ann Pete spluttered, "What do you mean you're separated?" The news of her grandson's arrival shocked her. She literally collapsed into her chair. Caroline was pleased that her son had not bothered to explain everything to them, and she could embellish the situation in her own favor. She did not, however, go into the details of her interactions with the boy. The parents did not dare to go to Andrew, but called him to a serious conversation. He realized, of course, how rash it had been to forget about them and to allow Caroline to influence their opinions. But that was of secondary importance now. He kept the phone in his hand, waiting anxiously for news from his lawyer, whom he had instructed to gather information about the warden and try to find out if Iris was really alive. "What on earth are you doing?" asked his mother as soon as he entered the house. "What are you talking about?" Andrew replied, trying to keep a cool face. "Where did that child come from? And why are you hurting Caroline? Kicked her out." "How could you do that? They'd only just got married." Mrs. Ann Pete talked on, but no one listened. Finally, my father entered the conversation. "Don't embarrass us, Andrew. You're acting weird." "Parents, please calm down," smiled at them. "I'm not acting weird. Yes, you have a grandson. This is Iris's son." When Mrs. Ann Pete heard the name, she was speechless and almost cried. Her husband stopped talking and went into his study. The phone rang and Andrew, seeing the lawyer's name, quickly said goodbye and ran out of the house. He was not in the mood for detailed explanations, especially since the news had come overwhelming. She is indeed alive and living with the very uncomplicated man he met in the colony, but not as a prisoner, but rather as a voluntary recluse. They say in the village that they probably have some sort of pact. They say he released her, but on the condition that she would live with him. I don't think she knows she's presumed dead. "Where do they live?" Andrew asked. "So the same place in a village near the colony. He has a big mansion with a fence, an intercom and a guard at the entrance." Alive, alive. It was pounding in my head. She must be freed. A plan came to mind that was completely insane, but if it came to fruition, Andrew would see Iris. Bribing the local janitor was a simple matter. He'd never seen so much money in his entire life. And it was a simple matter of saying he was ill and going into hospital for a long period of time. Then it was more complicated. One snowy day, the house of the chief of the colony received a phone call. The guard let a vagrant wrapped in rags inside. He wanted to apply for a job with accommodation. Judging by the condition of the yard, through which narrow paths were trampled, a worker was really needed there. "Do you have a passport?" the owner of the mansion asked sharply. "Yes," calmly replied the visitor and took out fake documents. "Give it here. Here is your place. Now live there. There's also a shovel and other tools." Andrew went to work, happy with his own good fortune. He was given a room in a separate house, and no one but the warden of the colony ever left the master's house. But the next day, when he left for work, a woman's figure appeared in the window. She was watering the flowers on the first floor, and glimpsed downstairs where the new janitor was diligently clearing the grounds. He only had time to stare at her for a second, but his heart beat pleasantly. Someone was there, after all, and that gave him hope of seeing Iris. The next few days were hard. Andrew was starving because there was nowhere to cook, and the only shop sold almost nothing in the way of cooked food. A couple of pies were no good. He asked his employer for a favor, but he was in a bad mood and sent the janitor away. Apparently, he continued to resent him at home, because the morning after he left, a woman wrapped in a shawl came out into the street with a small pot, a plate, and a spoon in her hands. "I know you are hungry," sounded a familiar voice. "Damn hungry," smiled the janitor, dropping the shovel. Iris shuddered and almost dropped everything she had brought from her hands. She glanced fearfully in the direction of the guard's cabin. He was watching something of his own. "You can't tear him away," Andrew reassured her. "Why are you here?" "Why are you here?" Iris asked, equally frightened. "I've come for you. We have to get out of here." "No, Andrew. He's got all the papers." "I don't care about them. We'll make new ones. What's keeping you here?" "Andrew, he made me do it." "I didn't want to, I swear," Iris explained. In the distance, a gate rattled. Iris shuddered. "It's at the neighbors. Don't worry." Andrew, who wanted to run away with her right now, reassured her. "He made sure I had no way out. They threatened to kill me," Iris cried. "Here, have some food." Shoving the pot into his hands, Iris started back towards the door, but Andrew beat her to it. "Don't be afraid of anything. It'll be all right. I promise you." "You, Andrew, I believe you. Do you know how he is, how Mum is? I mean, he's forbidden me to speak to them, only in letters. And now I can't even do that." Her eyes are shining. "They're fine." Her eyes brightened. "He's staying with a nanny for now. I couldn't bear to tell him his mum was dead. He's been thinking about you. He's got a whole carload of presents for you." He chose the right thread to lure the recluse out of her confinement. Memories of her son overrode the fear in which she had to live all the time, and she made up her mind. The main thing now was to get outside the house unnoticed. Someone they knew would be waiting for them there. They decided to do it tomorrow, because today there was no time left before her husband came. He came back, as always, in the evening, but went not to the house, but straight to the janitor. "Are you trying to cheat me?" shouted the man. "What's the matter?" Not expecting such a turn of events, Andrew asked. "What is it?" grinned the man. "He asked me. What's the matter? It's because your father is very interested in why his son is working for me as a planforne. He's never been so angry with his parents before. Like this moment, his father has apparently set up surveillance on him. Oh my God, why do they always want to mind their own business?" "Get out," finished his monologue and threw his passport on the table. Andrew couldn't go back, knowing that his Iris was alone there with that bastard. It was hard. It felt like it was all his fault. His mistakes had only made things worse. But already standing under the windows of his house, Andrew knew for sure there was no time to retreat. After all, illegal detention of people is a crime, so he could be put in jail. The main thing was to get close enough without making any more rash decisions. Andrew Jr. met his father with great joy. He was afraid he would lose him again, like his mum and grandmother. A puppy named Charlie was running around. "Why did you name him that?" Andrew Sir asked with a smile. "It's the name of the robot in the cartoon. He is very good and kind," explained his son. As he ran off to the nursery, the nanny came in. "Andrew, I want to warn you. Andrew has been complaining a lot lately about pain somewhere on his left side. Shouldn't we take him to the doctor?" "We will," Andrew replied thoughtfully. He wanted to spend the whole evening with his son and calm down a little. But the call from the office made him snap out of it and start doing things again. Lately, he had neglected his business. leaving everything to his deputy. "What is this?" Andrew wondered unpleasantly as he leafed through the paperwork. A huge amount of money had disappeared from the accounts. Only one of his own could have done it. But how long will it take to find out who did it? Employees need to pay their salaries and customers need results. Andrew ran around the office, reprimanding one and another subordinate. He was torn from the impossibility to leave the business for a while, because it would threaten even more problems. Andrew was waiting for him at home, and Iris was waiting for him far away, all alone, not knowing if he would ever get out. "Amanda, take him to the children's clinic yourself, please," he asked the nanny. She called back after they'd been to the doctor. "They say it's something to do with his heart. They'll tell you more after they've had tests and analyses. It's getting worse by the hour." There were problems on all sides, none of them promising to be solved anytime soon. 2 weeks passed in the most intense tension. The phone stayed on until late at night. Conversations with the pediatric cardiologist, bank representatives, investigators. We were dealing with an illegal diversion of money from the company's accounts. No calls from business partners or Caroline's parents, and that was good, because dealing with her would definitely drain the last of his strength. On the way home, Andrew didn't realize he'd been speeding through a red light. The last thing he remembered was the big black car coming at him from the left and the loud pounding of his heart in his ears. Was that it? The thought flashed through his mind. A momentary thought and a heavy sleep came over him. Andrew had fallen into a coma. The doctors couldn't say anything about how the situation would develop. "Maybe we'd have to keep an eye on him," they said. His son brought his drawings, told his father about what he was doing at the preparatory course, and what he was able to teach Charlie. All he'd hear in response was the beeping of the machines. Nanny never took him home. One day he surprised her with an unexpected request. "Auntie, let's go and see Charlie's mom." "Where does she live?" "In the woods." "How are we going to find her?" "Well, she has a master. His name is Grandpa Mike. Shall we go?" "I don't even know how to get there," answered Nanny, thinking how best to talk the boy out of it. "I've got the address." Andrew handed her a small piece of paper with the address and phone number he'd got from his grandfather, just in case. It seemed that just such an occasion had presented itself. He missed being close to his mum, and as he shifted his longing to the puppy, he was sure that Charlie missed his mum too. Amanda called the number, and to her surprise, the voice on the phone was very happy and invited them over. After buying dog treats and sweets for tea, they went to look for the mysterious hermit. The puppies had already been sorted out, and now only Mum and son were left in the house. When Charlie saw his own, he ran off to play. Andrew was overjoyed. "Let them play," said Grandpa Mike cheerfully, "and we'll have tea with honey." After hearing from Nanny about Andrew Sr.'s trip to the colony, the failed attempt to free the boy's mother, she didn't know the details, and the accident that had left his host in a coma, Grandpa Mike thought. When the guests left, he spent the evening pondering what he could do to help. It seemed it was time to act. Even though the perpetrator was his own son, Mike called an old friend who, though retired, probably still had old connections in law enforcement. So he did. The friend contacted the prosecutor's office and urged them to check on the husband. He was not at home for 2 days, but Anna had no doubt that he would return. Although inside there was growing anxiety, some feeling suggested that something had happened. Finally, she could not stand it, went out into the yard and turned to the guard, who was definitely aware of what was happening. "He was arrested," he replied indifferently, looking at his clipboard. "Arrested how? What for?" He didn't have time to answer because a service car appeared on the screen of the external camera. Police officers came to them. After a lot of explanations, examination of papers and correspondence, Iris was released. She took some money from the piggy bank in the hallway to get home, looking around as if she was afraid of being followed. She reached the bus stop. It felt strange to be going home, even though she had dreamed about it for a very long time. Outside the window, the sky was drearily gray. The snow was falling. Sparse trees whizzed past. She was also sad at heart. Her old life had long ago fallen apart, and would she be able to build something new? When she arrived home, she found her flat empty. Everything was still as it had been. Her mother's shawl on the back of a chair, unfinished knitting, an open book on the table. Her son's old toys were lying on the floor. Her picture was also framed on the shelf. The neighbor was already packing her bags. She was due to be given the keys to her new flat the other day. She hugged Iris, who could barely stand on her feet. "You don't have time for this, of course, but go to the administration office. This flat is yours now. They should give you a new place too. It's all under demolition," they said, the woman advised. Iris didn't care about housing. She just wanted to die in this flat, to freeze. lying on the sofa and clutching a teddy bunny to her chest, all that was left of her childhood. "Get up," her neighbor came in the next day with the kettle and buns. "Your son is waiting for you. You have to live." It's too soon to give up. Iris had no idea how to find him. She didn't know Andrew's address. She had no phone, no money. Who could she turn to? "I have his number. Let's call him," her neighbor prompted, and after a minute she gave Iris excited looks to see if anyone was tied in. Nanny Amanda had become the only person responsible for Andrew. There had been no word from his parents or Caroline since the accident. Even more so, the boy wasn't interested. When he saw his mum, he couldn't understand what was going on. The face was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She smiled, and then everything came back to normal. "Mum," he smiled back. She walked over to her son and hugged him tightly. He had grown, matured, but his hair was still sticking out in all directions. He had a car in his hands and funny slippers in the shape of dogs on his feet. Iris was finally able to go out and feel like a free person who belonged to herself. Andrew took care of her, handed her all the presents he had prepared, showed her where everything was. He bragged that he had managed to teach Charlie some simple commands. "Sit," he said to the dog, and he waved his tail like a propeller and happily obeyed, for which he received a few pellets of food. "Mum, shall we go to Dad's?" he asked the day after her arrival. "Come on," she replied and blushed, realizing that she had to say something. To explain her silence of many years, "Have you made friends with him?" "Yes," said the boy with pleasure, munching colored sweets and accidentally putting a pellet of food in his mouth. They both laughed. Iris exhaled. Everything here had resolved itself, and her son wasn't mad at her. Before going to see Andrew, they stopped by the clinic where her son was seen. The doctor was genuinely pleased to hear that his little patient had his mother back. Lately, he had always been accompanied by a nanny, which suggested that his parents didn't take much care of him. "Your Andrew has a heart defect. But don't worry. According to our observations, it should close on its own. We're already seeing improvement. Based on the latest tests, we'll continue to monitor it. In the meantime, let him enjoy life, eat a full diet, and get plenty of sleep. I've written out the rations and given them to the nanny." Andrew, who was sitting on a bench in the corridor, looked at his mum and asked quietly, "Mum, I'm not going to die like Grandma." "No, of course you won't. You're just a little boy. And only very, very old people die," she answered as cheerfully as possible with a heavy feeling in her throat. "And Daddy? Will he wake up soon too?" "Yes," you see, the son cheered up, and on the way to the hospital he kept talking. He talked about the teacher who taught preparatory classes on Saturdays, about his future classmates, cartoons, and New Year presents the new ethics. He became quiet only in the ward where his father was still lying. Blue walls, white bed linen, red lights of devices. In the silence of the hospital, everything seemed bright and unchanging, as if nothing could change. The young doctor they had seen first had reported reassuringly that the patient's condition had improved, though he had not regained consciousness. Today, the nurse noticed that he moved his arm and made a quiet sound. "Let's not give up hope. Talk to him. Medicine is medicine, but sometimes miracles happen." Mother and son looked at each other. Iris smiled. Andrew shrank back. Hospitals had always frightened him. Now, sitting in the room next to Andrew Sr., they were silent. Iris was the first to break the silence. "Well, Andrew, here we are. I don't know what you'd say now, but I think you'd be glad. What do you think, Andrew?" The boy shook his head. "If only Charlie could be brought here. He misses me too." "Oh, why don't we ask the doctor if he'll let us?" Iris suggested. Seeing her son sigh, she changed the subject. "Shouldn't we bring something tasty? The smell of pies might wake him up." "Oh, yes, it would," came a husky man's voice. "Daddy!" Andrew Jr. exclaimed excitedly. Iris was confused. She didn't know what to do or say. The moment was so welcome, yet so unexpected, that it was absolutely confusing. "How are you?" she asked, leaning towards him. "I'll get the doctor." "Wait." Andrew Sr. wheezed. "I want to look at you." He lay on the bed, painfully pale, with half-closed eyes, but happy. On their way back, they bumped into Caroline in the corridor. She recognized Andrew Jr. and looked angrily at Iris. There she was, the cause of all her troubles. "You're not going to make it," she hissed, stepping forward and beating the rhythm loudly with her huge heels. "She doesn't love me," the boy explained, skipping down the path on his way home. "I even ran away from her into the woods." Andrew Sr. was on the mend. Iris and her son visited him almost every day. The day Caroline confidently got to him, they had a difficult conversation, culminating in the decision to file for divorce. As soon as Andrew was discharged from the hospital, lying already at home on his bed, he began to sort out the affairs of the business. Contrary to his worst expectations, the company did not go bankrupt, and one of the employees was eventually caught cheating and fired. The money, of course, still had to be recovered, which was very difficult, but at least there were to be no new leaks, and no one from the team quit. The work continued. Iris stayed living in Andrew's flat. He saw her every day while cooking dinner or playing with his son. He became more and more convinced that he had never loved anyone more than this small, fragile, but so strong woman. She still suffered from her past. She often cried when she remembered her mom. She didn't know how to move on. But Andrew didn't remind or reproach her, and that made her feel better. One day, when he was still lying on the bed, the bell rang. The guests had arrived. She greeted them, let them inside. When Mrs. Ann Pete entered the room, she noticed at once that her son was well looked after. The flat was clean, with a mug of hot cocoa, homemade pastries, and fruit on the nightstand. He was just tasting the treats when his parents appeared at the door. His father looked as if he'd been brought in by force. His mother looked genuinely pleased. The last time they'd seen Andrew was when they'd come to the hospital, but he hadn't woken up yet. "Son, let's make peace," Mrs. Ann Pete said, sitting down beside him. "Are we really like enemies?" "Yes," Dad said. "Well, you two talk and I'll be off. I have something to do." The mother went out and closed the door behind her. Father and son, left alone, began a difficult conversation about the past. For the first time in many years, they seemed to have a sincere understanding, though it was still far from ideal. Mrs. Ann Pete returned to the hallway, picked up the large bag she had left there, and knocked on the door to the nursery. Iris and Andrew Jr. were sitting on the floor, putting together a tower of cubes. She was startled, but didn't show it and got to her feet. The boy looked confused at his mum, then at his grandmother, and continued to sit. "Is your name Iris? And you, Andrew?" the woman asked politely, and the two nodded their heads in response. "Would you like some tea?" Iris suggested, seeing her guest's genuine embarrassment. "That would be a pleasure." Mrs. Ann Pete was delighted. While they drank tea in the kitchen, Andrew showed his grandmother's presents and rejoiced at the addition of new cars. He has generally got so many more toys lately than he could ever have dreamed of before. Andrew's mother was a gossipy gossip, but she was still kind, sympathetic, and wanted to live in peace. Iris, for her part, held no grudge against them for not allowing them to meet years ago. The grandfather did not dare to come to his grandson, but just stood in the doorway and even smiled, seeing how happy his wife was listening to his grandson's stories. And Iris was pleased that her son was communicating so freely with his grandmother. He seemed to be surprised at this, because he was occasionally embarrassed. When Andrew finally got back on his feet, he did not hesitate to propose to Iris so that she would no longer feel insecure. Plus, he's determined to bring up her old cases and get to the bottom of everything to refute the unfair accusation. Once that happened, she could, if she wanted to, get a good job. As she got used to her new life, Iris blossomed. Her former cheerfulness and lightness returned to her, and her husband was delighted to see his great love reappear before him. The mother-in-law kicked the village orphan daughter-in-law out the door, and after a while of seeing her, numbers were crucial in Nayli's life. And could it be otherwise with more than 40 years of accounting experience? Immediately after the institute, she was assigned to a food processing plant, where she worked faithfully for more than 10 years, until the collapse of the union. The combine was drowning in debts, and by the mid-90s finally collapsed. While others ran in panic about tomorrow, Nayli, then still Nayli, quickly realized who takes control of the market, and through old connections got a job in a construction company, which was run by brothers. Nayli faithfully kept the books, often received good gifts from the bosses for labor in the form of cognac and expensive foreign candy. Nayli was not ashamed to participate in the dubious affairs of the owners of the company, then secured a spacious 2-room apartment in the center of the city for nothing. Own figures never let her down. She could rely on them and only on them. The dashing 90s were replaced by the new millennium. Gradually, loopholes and holes in the laws and taxation system became less and less. It was no longer possible to pull off the old schemes, and the legitimacy of her employer's business was becoming more and more suspicious. Nayli prudently quit her job when she realized that she smelled a stink, and went to work in the university accounting department. The pay there, of course, was more modest, but it was peaceful. Yes, and take a remote maintenance of document management of some small entrepreneurs. No one forbade her. Secretly, of course. The main thing was that the numbers were happy again. Soon Nayli turned into Nayli Smith, She was respected by her colleagues for her acumen, experience, and impeccable professionalism. She was also feared by the students, where Nina Ivanovna taught economics and other specialized disciplines, having quickly received a correspondence pedagogical education. Figures pleased, led her through life, and never once failed. Only in one thing the figures did not help. Nina Ivanovna had no personal life by the age of 60. True, there was a joyous son, Matthew. The woman met his father while she was working for the brothers. It was a visitor from the village, a handsome guy, with a rich imagination, who misled her. A pretty accountant. When Nelly suspected that he was interested in her apartment, specifically the propiska in it, she noisily kicked the suitor out and found out she was pregnant the same week. From a small age, Matthew she brought up disciplined, collected, and responsible. The boy at the age of 4 could fry eggs, never cried or complained. He graduated from school with a silver medal. Nelly dreamed that her son received a higher education, and therefore saved money for it almost from his first grade. And when he passed on the budget, and even at the law school, the woman could not rejoice. Money in one piece, and her son will be a lawyer, as she wanted. Since Matthew's birth, Nelly has never had another serious relationship. She'd had affairs, of course, but it was always numbers that interfered. The beau didn't earn enough. What kind of a man was he who earned less than she did? It's a shame to go out in public with such a man. He wasn't tall enough, or too old, or too young. And constantly it seemed to Nelly that all the gentlemen are trying to steal her living space, gained even if not quite honest, but painstaking labor. In the big city, there are many who want to settle down without much worry at someone else's expense. Nelly was determined not to be that expense. All she cared about were the numbers, the welfare of herself and her son. That evening, Nelly waited for her son to come to dinner, somehow nervously. First she broke a cup, then she scattered salt on the table. The woman was not a superstitious woman, but the resulting mess irritated her. Matthew had shown up at 9 o'clock, cheerful and overjoyed, a vivid expression of emotion he didn't often display. And Nelly didn't welcome such extravaganzas from experience. She knew they usually had 3 reasons, and they were rarely good ones: in love, drunk, or an idea that required money. The first had been settled long ago. Matthew was indifferent to that. He wasn't partial to the second one either, so. "Well, tell me what you've already thought up," Nelly asked, looking at her offspring from head to toe through her thin glasses. "What have you thought of, Mom?" Matthew tried to hide his enthusiasm, but it didn't work very well. He was literally bursting with bright colors. "I can't see it," the woman shook her head. Matthew hesitated and sat down on a stool at the table. He knew that, as usual, his mother rejected all his ideas. She thought she knew what was best for her son. No, Matthew was grateful for her sensitivity, but he had never tried to follow her instructions completely. When she forbade him to get a dog as a child, the enterprising Matthew disappeared to the house of his friend Andrew. He did not like his German shepherd Palma, and with the dog Matthew quickly got used to it, even walked with it, gladly replacing the lazy companion. After such walks of her son, Nelly wrinkled her nose, not understanding why suddenly the apartment smelled of dog. In high school, Matthew dreamed of playing the guitar, but Nelly said that the guitar was the domain of idlers. Look at Vysotsky. How much did he accomplish? Mother was wringing her hands in front of her son. But Vysotsky is a legendary man, 16-year-old Matthew parried. A good legend, a circus performer. Nelly spent her life in theaters with her guitar and eventually died at 42. You know why? You should lead a normal life, a serious life. Think about your future promising profession and not play the guitar. Matthew realized that it was useless to argue. His mother's stubbornness was strong. It was a blessing that she worked a lot and was interested only in her son's grades, regimen, and nutrition. Otherwise, Matthew was exempted from the need to report. If they didn't ask, they could. He got an old guitar, found new strings in the morning before dawn, and asked the music teacher to help him with tuning the instrument. In a couple of days, Matthew had a good guitar, though shabby, but it sounded perfect. He played it on camping trips with his class, at first-grade matinees at school, and in Andrew's father's garage. Open fingers he honed in cold water at night. After a few years, however, the love of strings in the guy waned, and the guitar stayed at Andrew's buddy in the garage finally. "Mom, you've been saving money for my education, and I'm studying on a budget. Matthew started from afar. Let's say Nayli raised her right eyebrow. She wasn't wrong again. I was thinking that I could get a part-time job in the evenings after school. It's about time. I'm 22 soon. Matthew knew just how to placate his mother before revealing his part-time plans. Who's stopping you? Nayli agreed, not yet understanding the connection in her son's words. Well, I got my license in high school, but I haven't had much practice. I have a license. I have free money. I need a car. I'll go to a cab, earn money, and gain experience. You'll always need a car. Matthew exhaled. A car. Then Nayli muttered. Matthew waited breathlessly, like a pigeon, waiting for a handful of grain from its master. Nayli was figuring out what the car gave and what it would require. A vehicle of one's own was a convenience. Meanwhile, age was making itself felt with sore knees, blood pressure, and an increasing need to get around. The money spent on the car will not hit the family budget because it was put aside long ago. But the question of earning money, but let her son earn a penny, but really learn to drive, will become more responsible, as she wanted. The main thing is not to neglect his studies. The figures add up. A car is a necessary thing, unlike a guitar, Nayli said more warmly. Matthew opened his mouth. He was already making backup plans, how to persuade his friend to hide the car at his place, how to deal with the evening absence. And now this was a gift. Do you mind? He asked with a smile he couldn't quite contain. I'm not euphoric, but I support it, Nayli replied graciously. Just be careful what you buy. Don't get a thank you. He hugged his mother, and happy, jumped into the room. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he did want a part-time job in a taxi cab, but even more than that. Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly. But that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks, you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it, and a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. A cat in a bag. Ask a knowledgeable person for help. And don't try to skip classes and fail your diploma. Mom, I know, Matthew reassured her. Thank you. He hugged his mother and jumped into the room happy. Of course, the boy had lied a little. Yes, he really did want a part-time job in the cab business. But even more than that, Matthew wanted freedom from his mother's control. A car offered that opportunity, even if only partially. He could have bought it on the sly, but that wasn't the way the budding lawyer's mind worked. Matthew realized that he needed to prepare the ground and get his mother's official permission to buy it. Then it would be difficult for her to accuse him of anything. And if you periodically bring in the money you earn, Matthew thinks you'll get approval and you can relax. A week later, Matthew got a foreign car, though not a new one, but not a bad one. Dan, Andrew's father, personally helped him choose it, and a car mechanic can't go wrong. Andrew persuaded Matthew to celebrate the purchase on the first night, but he refused. Instead, he drove around the neighborhood, at first cautiously, getting used to the character of his new friend, and then boldly drove into the city. The car behaved perfectly. In the morning, Matthew drove his mother to work and then ran to his classes, and in the evening he drove around the streets, picking up passengers. Nayli was at first distrustful of the car, but quickly realized how much relief this means of transportation would bring her. Soon the woman got used to it, and even periodically asked her son if he had refueled the car after work and if it needed washing. Matthew chuckled in secret, but did not show it. He had another reason for buying the car, but no one knew about it. At 15, like any teenager, Matthew's hormones were running wild. He became interested in girls. No, the affable and agile boy had never had any trouble making friends with them. Now he was attracted to his former girlfriends in a different way. He wanted to talk to them, to do nice things for them, not just run around the yard. That's how Matthew got his first girlfriend from the parallel class. But when Nayli found out about it, she made a huge scandal. Matthew stood in front of his mother, almost crying, and she lectured him that studying was more important than relationships with girls. The boy wanted to spite his mother by continuing to date the girl of his choice. But Nayli did her best. She found the phone number of the girl's parents and strictly informed them that their daughter was distracting Matthew from his studies. The unyielding tone of the chief accountant put all the dots on I. Matthew had been shunned by a former friend at school. Nayli thought she was doing the right thing, because her own life had never been about the joys of love, only problems and nerves. Why waste precious time on such nonsense? First you have to achieve something, make a reputation, learn, and then look for a suitable couple. And only one that would suit her, Nayli, completely. And some empty-headed girl to stop her Matthew from moving forward. No. Matthew quietly hated his mother's position, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He realized it was useless to argue with her. He had to maintain a secret private life. However, whether it was his aura or Nayli's invisible hand of protection that stretched far away, every new girl did not stay with him for long. At the institute, a quiet horror began around Matthew. Everyone knew where his mother worked, and among graduate students and faculty, gossip spread at the speed of light. And every new girlfriend of her son, the overbearing accountant and part-time faculty member, crucified her classes as best she could. And if she couldn't do it herself, she asked her colleagues to do it for a small favor. One student, Nayli, and her comrades were so driven to such an extent that the poor girl transferred to another university. Matthew eventually realized that if you look for a friend, then outside the institute, where you can hide her from her mother as much as possible. Nothing good came out of this idea. His mother could detect the girl's presence near him by the smell of perfume. She called him if he was late after class. Matthew couldn't get out much, as Nayli encouraged only academic zeal or rare friendships. The shadow of his mother, always invisibly standing behind the young lawyer's back, frightened the girls, and they quickly severed relations with him. Of course, no one wanted to have such a principled and intrusive mother-in-law. Tiana stood in front of the restaurant manager, her tear-red eyes drooping to the floor. For the third time this week, Gavin was sternly reprimanding the waitress just around the corner from the kitchen. "Third time this week you've gotten on my nerves and made me look like an idiot in front of my guests," he said. "But I didn't mean to. I was pushed," the girl tried to justify herself. "We all don't want something. Tiana, you didn't want to break glasses on Monday? You didn't want to forget the dirty rag on the hall table on Wednesday? Didn't want to spill wine on our regular guest today?" The manager folded his arms and lowered his voice, instilling a faint hope in Tiana's heart. "I'll be more careful, honestly, I promise." Gavin sighed irritably. "Promise your mom you'll be back by 11 p.m., and I'll have to fire you. Employees like you are a loss and a disgrace to the establishment. You'll take the money you earned today as a paycheck for your shift and get out of here." Tiana opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes stung even more. The manager left. The girl worked a few more hours, despite the dislike of the restaurant's customers. She changed her clothes, stuffed a few bills into the pocket of her cloak, and slipped out of the service exit in a shadow. Only on the street did Tiana allow herself to cry. She had been used to the fact that nothing in life was easy since she was a little girl. Tiana had lost her parents early and knew how hard it was to earn a penny for bread. When she was 7, her family and little brother died in a fire. Nothing was left of the household. The frightened little girl was taken in by an elderly neighbor, Aunt Lexi. She raised the girl, gave her everything she could. But Aunt Lexi could not do much to feed, to drink, to love, and only that. The neighbor's modest money was not enough for beautiful clothes, toys, or sweets. People in the village do not live poorly at all. Tiana helped her mother as much as she could. She took care of the garden and a small farm with 12 chickens while she was at school. From a small age, Tiana knew how to do everything around the house, cooking and baking. After school, she stayed with Aunt Lexi, even though she insisted on sending her to get an education. How could I leave you? Aunt Tiana was carefully smoothing the corner of the pillowcase with an old iron. Come on, Tiana. Aunt Lexi sat in the chair next to her. I'm not going anywhere. And you need to get on with your life. You're not going to be cleaning up after me forever. We had this conversation many times. Auntie was cheerful, but Tiana could see that she was finding it harder and harder to do her usual housework every month. In the end, the girl insisted that her aunt go to the city and be examined. The doctors prescribed heart medication and monthly routine checkups. Seeing the prices at the pharmacy, Tiana just splashed her hands. And then she realized that she had to leave after all to move to the city and work so that her aunt could be treated. Without education, it was hard for a girl to find a job, and she had to live somewhere else. On weekends, she took the train to the village to visit her Aunt Lexi. Tiana rented a tiny dorm room on the edge of town and got a job as a cleaner in a shopping center. Things went well at first, but one day she tripped and a bucket of water spilled out. As a result, one of the stores was left without lights and customers for 2 days. Tiana was fired without pay. The girl did not grieve long and decided to try to work as a nanny in a recruitment agency. They looked squeamishly at her manicure-less hands, dirty from working in the vegetable garden and scrubbing floors, and said, "We've looked at your nails and we're asking you to leave." Tiana sighed, but these very dirty by the standards of city ladies' hands did not put down. She started handing out leaflets and newspapers. True, the income from such work was quite modest. Once in those very newspapers, she saw an ad that the restaurant requires an assistant waiter, dishwasher. She was accepted without much questioning, was given gloves, a sponge, and told to start work the same day. For 2 months, the girl worked hard, washed and rubbed glasses, washed plates and pans to a shine. One day in the restaurant, a waitress did not come out. The manager burst into the kitchen, took a quick look at Tiana, told her to change, put on an apron, and go out into the hall to serve the guests. The first few days were hard, but the girl took to the task diligently. She quickly mastered the simple craft of waitressing. "You're fast," Gavin once told her. "It would be easier for me to hire a granny at the car wash than to look for an adequate employee in the hall." Things were going well at first, with customers leaving good tips. Tiana bought herself some decent clothes, sent more money to the village, some guests, and a supply of medicine for her aunt. And then the black streak began. Then that rag absent-mindedly forgotten in a hurry on one of the tables. Then broken dishes. And now a guest poured wine on the table, and finally Tiana was fired. The girl walked down the night street, wiping her tears. The most frustrating thing was that she had already thought that everything was getting better, spent all the money and did not pay for the room on time. And the owners were waiting for payment and were already looking askew at the young tenant. When Tiana got home, she found another surprise. Her belongings had been piled carelessly into a gym bag and put out into the hallway with an obvious hint. There was no more strength to cry. The paycheck for one shift wouldn't be enough to pay for a month in advance. Tiana didn't grovel after being evicted in absentia. The girl grabbed her bag by the handles, unhooked her keys from the keychain, placed them on the bollard next to her, and left. The penetrating October wind blew in her face. She would walk to the train station, and there she would take the first train in the morning to her aunt's village. Cry quietly into her pillow at night, and try again. Each time, though, it was harder and harder, but the health of her family man was more precious to Tiana. Matthew was in a great mood. He had done a good job today. Outside the window, the streetlights, the bright signs, the neon lights of the city in the rain seemed to flow with color. It was even brighter. At night, from the beginning of the shift, the work went as smoothly as possible. There were expensive orders and interesting passengers. Until 6, Matthew discussed with a philosophy professor, laughed with animators in costumes, drove 2 elderly girlfriends to the theater. The guy liked to drive around the city. He felt free and relaxed. Of course, there were some silent passengers, but for some reason they were a minority. The atmosphere in the car apparently disposed even the hardened silent ones to talk. By midnight, the downpour had intensified. Matthew dropped off the last passenger at the edge of town, near the private sector, and decided that it was time to call it a day. He made a leisurely stop at a gas station, picked up a coffee and a sandwich, tipped the gas station attendant, and headed home in a melancholy mood. There were hardly any people on the streets at this late hour, so Matthew was surprised to see a girl walking along the curb. She was soaked through. She was carrying a heavy sports bag in her hands, and her cloak was useless. "Young lady, what are you doing?" "Get in. I'll give you a ride home." The guy stopped and opened the door from the passenger side. "And I have nowhere to go." He heard a completely broken voice. "I don't have a home here, but let me take you somewhere." "The weather's terrible," Matthew insisted. "It's free." He suddenly felt surprisingly sorry for the girl. Not because she was walking alone at night in a downpour, but because Matthew felt a silent call for help. The kind of call you might read in the eyes of a puppy abandoned in a box. "Sit down, please." "I can't leave you here at a time like this." Matthew emphasized the word please very strongly. The stranger, he thought, sighed. Then she skipped over a puddle by the curb and grabbed the door handle. They drove in silence for a while. Matthew turned on the heater to warm the shivering passenger. "How did you end up here?" The boy was the first to ask, and Tiana told him. It was as if she had been saving it all up for months, and now she was out of control. She talked, and Matthew listened until he realized she was crying. "You'll forgive me for sitting here crying like this. It's a terrible shame for you," a stranger, she apologized confusedly as the car stopped at a stoplight. Instead of answering, Matthew pulled some tissues out of the glove compartment. "But why a stranger?" "My name is Matthew." He held out a paper handkerchief to the girl with a smile. "Tanya," she sobbed in response. "Well, now we know each other. Would you like some coffee or tea?" Tanya had no time to answer, as he stopped at another gas station and disappeared in the doorway. 5 minutes later, he handed the girl a hot cup, a small chocolate bar, and threw his jacket from the back seat over her shoulders. They pulled off to the pad to the side. Matthew tried to lighten the mood as best he could, even trying some awkward jokes. This girl's story seemed to him like a mockery of fate, and at the same time he felt a desire to help. It was strange. Matthew wouldn't call himself sentimental or tearful. He didn't give money to beggars, and he wasn't Benjamin. "And now I have nowhere to go. I can hardly afford a hotel. I don't know much about the city." Tanya finished her story, warming her fingers on a hot drink. "Please bring me to the station. If you don't mind, I'll wait for the train there. You'll freeze at the station in your wet clothes. Stay at my place, and tomorrow I'll take you to the station," Matthew said. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about it. He didn't think about his mother or morality at that moment. He wanted from the bottom of his heart to do something good for his accidental passenger. Tanya froze and for the first time truly stared at Matthew in amazement. He nodded silently, with a slight smile, confirming his offer. And Tanya suddenly agreed. Tired, wet, exhausted, she figured she simply had nothing to lose, and so be it. That late evening, Matthew spoke to his mother in a way he had never spoken to her before. Nayli, of course, was against the idea of her apartment acting as a lodging house for unemployed women. However, for the first time, her son did not ingratiate himself to her or ask for permission, but spoke in a voice as firm as a rock. Nayli felt a chill run down her spine. So different from the Matthew she was used to. "She'll clean herself up, and I'll see her off tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't embarrass yourself, Mom. If you can't kick the poor girl out, you'll only embarrass yourself in front of her and the neighbors." Matthew firmly contradicted his mother once more and went downstairs to the car to fetch Tiana. Nayli was quietly seething, but for some reason she couldn't object. Had something about him changed that evening? Something that made the woman, against her will, look at her son differently. The university's chief accountant defiantly closed herself in her bedroom and turned off the lights. Matthew put Tiana in his room and moved to the sofa in the living room. The girls' wet clothes were hung on the backs of chairs and radiators. "Good night to you, Tiana," he said as he closed the door. "Good night to you too." "Thank you," the girl replied, lay back on her pillow, closed her eyes, and for the first time in many days truly smiled. Matthew stood outside the door, wondering what had happened to him today. Was it an attack of pity, compassion, an outburst of emotion, or had his soul reached out to someone unfamiliar but dear, someone in need of protection and care? Early in the morning, Nayli got ready for work. She was offended by her son's behavior. To prove it, she had gotten up at the crack of dawn and decided to go to the university herself, though she was used to Matthew driving her. But principle and resentment were dearer. Nayli examined her guest's old-fashioned coat on the rack by the bathroom, then glanced even more squeamishly at the stale, dirty sneakers. Things in the hallway hinted that she was not noted for her tidiness, her limited means. The woman stepped over the stranger's shoes, deciding to wash the hallway with bleach upon her return, and left. The young men awoke almost simultaneously. Matthew saw through the doorway as Tiana timidly tried to find the bathroom. It was not without some awkwardness. Matthew, like a hospitable host, had even made breakfast. But it was made of sandwiches and tea early in the morning, when he himself dropped the unpretentious dishes. The sandwich landed sausage side down and landed on Tiana's pant leg with a piece of butter. The young people stared at the sad piece of salami on the plate for a few seconds, and then laughed. Matthew felt so relaxed and at the same time at ease with this girl that he hadn't even noticed his mother's absence from the morning. Of course, any awkwardness was gone from the conversation. "Are you on your way to the station?" he asked. They chatted like old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Tiana had forgotten all about what had happened to her yesterday. It was sunny, just like this sunny city. She told her sudden companion about her childhood at her aunt's house, about how she liked to pick dandelion bouquets in the vegetable garden, about the time she was pecked by a rooster, about her first for dictation. There was no sadness or longing in these stories, only carefree childhood and sincere delight of a child. Matthew listened eagerly, attentive to every word, absorbing these pure emotions, which he almost never got from his mother. With her commanding temperament, she was always dry, not praising, not encouraging, not interested in her son's dreams and discoveries. Nayli was preoccupied with the primary worldly tasks: food, regimen, studies, profession, finances. Matthew had enough friends. Teachers at school loved him. Girls were not shy to make eyes at him. But all this was a trifle compared to what this 19-year-old girl from the village told him today. With simplicity, purity, and trust. They waited for the train together, sitting on the platform. "Thank you very much." "I don't know how to thank you," Tiana said again with some awkwardness as she said goodbye. "It's okay," Matthew dismissed her. "But I do. Let's meet again when you get back and go to the movies." Tiana was a girl from the countryside who had come to the city. She met Matthew and a warm friendship developed between them. Matthew was charmed by Tiana's openness, spontaneity, and cheerfulness, something he lacked in his relationship with his own strict mother, Nayli. When Tiana was leaving, Matthew suggested that they meet again when she came to town and go to a movie. Tiana was happy at the prospect. Upon returning home, Matthew faced the displeasure of Nayli's mother, who considered Tiana a country wench and tried to get rid of any trace of her in the apartment with bleach. A conflict arose, during which Matthew for the first time openly confronted his mother, tired of her excessive control over his life. This situation highlighted the overdue contradictions between Matthew and his mother Nayli. On the one hand, Nayli cared for her son, but at the same time she was overprotective and tried to impose her rigid attitudes on him. And Matthew, having met Tiana, felt a longing for freedom, lightness, and spontaneity in relationships. This story touches on the themes of growing up, gaining independence, the value of simple human joys, and the ability to assert one's boundaries even in relationships with loved ones. The clash of two life philosophies caused a generational conflict between mother and son. "I'm sick of your control," said Nayeli. "I see you've picked up a lot of chutzpah from that hillbilly too." "Better chutzpah than a lifetime of being told what to do by someone else," Matthew said, and slammed the front door so hard that the figurines fell from the table. He slept in the car that night. Such loud arguments with his mother had never happened before. The The boy had always held back or avoided sharp edges with cunning. But now something had been hurt that didn't want to put up with the insults. Tiana didn't tell her aunt what had happened. She said she was just visiting for a few days. The perceptive relative immediately noticed that her stepdaughter was unusually joyful. But, "Tiana, tell me, did you meet someone?" Aunt Lexi asked at dinner. The girl burst out in surprise and dropped her spoon into her plate, splashing the table. Aunt Lexi laughed. "Ouch. You don't have to answer that. I can already see that I've met a handsome man." Tiana told her named mother about Matthew. "The main thing is that the man is good. You don't see much selfless help these days." Aunt Lexi patted her stepdaughter's shoulder approvingly. "Auntie, I don't think I'm right for him," Tiana said. "And anyway, maybe that's true. I was already dreaming of a house with a rose garden. And if you don't dream, then why live?" The woman was genuinely surprised. "You should have fallen in love a long time ago. In my childhood, there was only school, vegetable garden, chickens. I'm old, you'll be sitting on my neck." "But Auntie, don't say that," Tiana objected. "Who else but me will help you? Youth is for dreaming, for joy, for falling in love. And you are doing a great deal for me. Go and meet him, and I'll give you something to dress up." Aunt Lexi got up and went into her room. From there, she heard the noise and creaking of an old closet. Soon the woman returned with 2 stud earrings. "This is what my late husband Alex gave me for my wedding in 1973. Ural emerald, a good luck stone." She placed the jewelry in the palm of the amazed Tiana's hand. The earrings were small, but elegant, even noble. The light green stone played in the sun, shimmering with facets. Aunt Lexi easily pushed Tiana to the mirror to try on the gift, and it was as if the jewelry was made for the girl. The emerald earrings looked even more beautiful against her brown hair. "Well, what's not a bride to be?" "Well done," Aunt Lexi said with a pat on the knee. Tiana laughed and took another sneak peek at herself in the reflection. That same night, Matthew called her himself. They chatted about everything and nothing. For about half an hour, the guy said he'd meet her at the train station. Also that he had a surprise. Tiana exhaled, awkwardly said goodbye, and went to bed, gazing dreamily at the fishnet shadows on the ceiling. Matthew did apologize to Nayli's mother for being rude when he cooled down. Still, the heated atmosphere in the apartment was hitting a nerve. It was amazing how Matthew had been practicing law at the university, operating with articles and laws, arguing with his professors, but he had been unable to defend his opinion to his mother until that day, because she had built her unquestionable rightness and authority into his head. Nayli listened to her son's apology and pretended to accept it too. But the coolness of the relationship betrayed the truth. Perhaps she was a little more critical of her son than usual, as if she were getting back at him for the offense. And he seemed impenetrably indifferent. About his studies, about cars, about passengers at work. Fears and worries. The invisible grit, he shook off his shirt and adjusted the collar of his coat. A worm of worry coiled inside Nayli. Had something changed? Whereas before she could confidently say she knew her Matthew from the get-go, now she couldn't. He was with her, and not with her at the same time. She'd been tempted to ask her son about her concerns several times, but she didn't know how to begin. The control she'd built her life around had been broken. The day of their second meeting was unusually warm for October. The sun was so hot that Tiana had taken off her cloak and was carrying it in her hands. Matthew even wore dark sunglasses, though he hid his eyes, which kept looking at the girl, her hair, her figure, her eyes, the polka dots on her blouse, the neat earrings. Every detail Matthew wanted to memorize and keep. In 3 days, he'd missed her so much it felt like they hadn't seen each other in forever. "So what's the surprise?" Tiana asked, tucking an embarrassed strand behind her ear. Matthew nodded enigmatically and took her hand, calmly and confidently at the same time. In that gesture, all the worry, fuss, and concern dissolved. They walked down a long alley littered with yellow maple leaves and found themselves in a pet store. "Do you want to get me a hamster?" Tiana laughed. Matthew only smiled again. "Look here for a moment," he said, and disappeared behind the racks of aquariums. Tiana looked at the strange fish, the funny guinea pigs, and the noisy parrots. She liked the atmosphere, and she had always loved animals. She used to feed the chickens from her hands as a little girl, stroking their feathers, but they only clucked and looked into her face with their bird eyes. Tiana was distracted from her thoughts when through the bars she was playing with a parrot, as green as a young pea. "I see you've already got the hang of it. You've got the hang of it," joked a small woman in an apron with the store's emblem. "Hello, Tiana. My name is Olivia. Can it be Olivia? Matthew told me you were looking for a job." "Aunt Olivia is my best friend Alex's mom," Matthew explained. "And she'd love to have you if you'd like to work for her, of course." Tiana couldn't believe her ears with joy. Yes, I agree. I'm ready to start today," she blurted out. Olivia laughed. "That's the spirit. But today is not necessary. In 2 or 3 days, find a place to live, and then call me." She handed Tiana her business card, confused and happy at the same time. Matthew had a few words with the friendly pet store owner, and they walked out. "This is the second time you've helped me?" "I already feel very uncomfortable about it," Tiana said. The girl looked at Matthew. "I didn't do anything," she said, jokingly raising her hands. "A car brought you home to me, and Aunt Oberon took you to work." "Of course she did," Tiana laughed and poked Matthew in the side with a finger of poorly hidden pride. Matthew whooped and laughed and immediately started tickling Tiana in return. They ran down the street like fools, one after another, giggling like schoolboys. Passers-by turned to look at the strange couple. But for them, the world gradually shrank to just each other. "Would you point your finger at me again if I said I'd help you a third time?" Matthew asked when they were out of breath. Tiana opened her mouth but said nothing. "Let's go somewhere," Matthew suggested. "And then we can go to the movies. I think we can make it in time." He looked at his wristwatch. 15 minutes later, the boys pulled up in front of the university dormitory. Matthew was friends with the head of the group, and he got along with the commandant. A small gift, a thank you envelope, a story about a poor relative, and he agreed to let the pseudo-student stay for a month or two. All the more so because Tiana's age was more than suitable. However, the commandant asked her to keep out of sight of the teachers and to come before 22. "Are you a wizard, honestly?" Tiana stared at Matthew as they walked outside with the room key. The boy scrutinized his chin and the back of his head, and then stated with a very serious look. "So no beard, like Hotabike. The magic hat is also missing. Verdict? No, I'm not a wizard." Matthew leaned over to Tiana and whispered conspiratorially. "Well, maybe a little." He made her laugh playfully and cleverly solved in one-day problems that took her weeks to solve. It was beginning to seem to her that the fairy tales her aunt had told her as a child were coming true. "Let's hurry." Matthew took her hand again, firm and gentle at the same time. "We have a movie starting in 20 minutes. It was one of the most joyous days of Matthew's life in recent memory. Yes, he'd skipped class today. Yes, he wouldn't go to work tonight. Yes, his mother would freak out if she found out. But why? Right now he feels needed and happy. And happiness is definitely worth a couple unattended lectures and a few missed passengers. Nayli tapped her pencil nervously on her desk. She had given the students an assignment. They sat like mice and wrote, while the instructor was lost in her own thoughts. 15 minutes ago, the department told her that Matthew had skipped class. He hadn't been in class before or after lunch. The helpful group supervisor had even asked Nayli if her son was all right. The woman threw something discreet in response, but inside her a mixture of resentment, frustration, and intense misunderstanding was slowly simmering. Matthew didn't pick up his phone and turned it off altogether. When had she not seen him treat her like that? So what if he became an adult? A mother should be respected at any age. She wants what's best for him to have a future, to become a powerful man, to make a name and a career. Where did it all start? Well, I guess it started with the unfortunate car. Yeah, that was a mistake. She let him, it was her own fault, believing a young man's good intentions. And now she's looking for him in that car. He's out of control. He feels he can do anything. So we've got to get rid of her as soon as possible. And Matthew can go back to being a good student and a good son. And if he wants to work, he can be a paralegal. You can't trust a man, even if it is your own child. She knows what's best. She's lived her life, and and managed to settle down well only because of her savvy, calculating, and pragmatic nature. So she can beat the crap out of a young guy's head. He'll thank her later, when his classmates are trampling the training ground in their boots. It's Daddy's bad blood. Nayli remembered her father. He, too, had been doing things during their short relationship. At first she'd even liked it, but then it became clear that without organization and discipline, nothing good would come of it. And a little later the beau made it clear what he really wanted. He was noodling about eternal love, encouraging Nayli to register him at her place. She couldn't let Matthew, whom she'd raised all her life, suddenly turn off the well-thought-out path. The weeds of excessive freedom, dubious girlfriends, and the like must be pulled out at the root. The chief accountant was distracted from his thoughts by a call from the class. The students hurriedly began to hand in their papers. Nayli didn't even glance at the stack of papers that piled up in the corner of her desk a couple minutes later. In her mind, she was already creating a plan to save her son and get him back on track. Matthew had come home in a light, uplifted mood, and that made the air sparkle. Nayli's mood was diametrically opposed. "Matthew, is there anything you want to tell me?" she asked, as soon as his son entered the kitchen and began to pour his tea. "No, Mom. Nothing yet." He smiled radiantly at his mother from the other end of the kitchen. "So skipping class isn't enough reason to talk." Nayli tried to hold back the outrage that was bursting out of her. Matthew's hand hovered in the air, a teaspoonful of sugar. He exhaled, then carefully poured the sugar into the cup and stirred the contents leisurely. "Mom, I'm a grown man. If there are tales on my studies from my absence, I'll deal with them myself. Don't be so nervous." Nayli's calm, measured tone made her son's voice boil even more. "Why are you embarrassing me? Do you want people to point the finger at me for having a truant son?" "No, Mom, you want to make a big deal out of nothing. One day of absenteeism is not the disaster you pictured." Matthew still spoke firmly and calmly, though it cost him some effort. For some reason, after talking to Jenny, he felt more mature, stronger, more confident. The weight that had been weighing on his shoulders since childhood and preventing him from objecting to his parent had dissolved into oblivion. With absenteeism, everything begins. Then women, then stupid adventures. Before you know it, you'll be without a diploma, without a profession, and without a decent place in life, Nayli said. "Mom, stop making such a big deal out of it, please." Matthew sighed tiredly and rubbed his temples. The lightness and the wonderful impression of the day were gone because of this inane interrogation. Nayli, like a horse that had been yanked backwards at the most crucial moment, felt the invisible thread of her control over her son fleeing further and further ahead. "Tell me, why did you skip your classes?" the woman asked. "I went to get my car repaired," Matthew replied. He realized that the truth would make his mother even more furious, so he said the first thing that came into his head. "You think I can't see you're lying?" Nayli threw the towel over her shoulder and put her hands to her sides. "What car?" "I'm old, Matthew, but I'm not crazy." "I've been fixing the car," the guy said expressively, separating his words with pauses. "Give me the keys," Nayli demanded. "I bought this car for you, and I'll take it back." What happened next broke some shudder in the woman's mind. Matthew silently pulled a bundle from his pocket, unhooked the alarm keys from it, and placed them in his mother's palm. Nayli stared at them stupidly somehow. The emotional army looked out from behind them confusedly, not realizing where the enemy had gone. "Take it. Only you can't drive." That's one thing. Matthew began to curl his fingers defiantly. "You can't sell it without the owner's signature." "Me, that's two. In the end, your money, as you say, will rot in the yard, or will become the prey of car thieves when they find a car without an owner for several months. That's three." Nayli stared at him in amazement, gulping for air. Matthew calmly took the keys. Then he came very close and said quietly but seriously, "Don't forget who I'm studying for, even if I occasionally skip classes." The guy took a mug of tea from the table and left the kitchen. The incident was over. The first stage of Nayli's plan had collapsed like a house of cards. She didn't like the job. For the first few weeks, she'd come to it as if it were an out-of-the-way place. Oberon marveled at how quickly the girl grasped everything and even did more on instinct. But the village childhood and her experience in caring for animals had its effect. Tiana quickly realized that she loved these hamsters, and what treats can only be given to parrots. In one day, she sorted through a warehouse of pet food. Then she cleaned 2 old aquariums to a shine which were dusty in the back room. "Well done," praised her store owner. "You can buy new fish if there is room." Tiana was not tired in the slightest. The work did not exhaust her as before. In the evening she came to the dormitory, read books, or looked for information about her furry feathered charges on the net. She didn't want to collapse on the bed and fall asleep. This peculiar training has borne fruit. The customers listened to the girl enthusiastically. When they faced the choice of buying a pet, Tiana sat little mice in the arms of children, showed how to properly catch fish with a net from the aquarium, explained how to teach parrots to talk. Oberon could not be pleased with such a smart and diligent worker. Tiana herself was quietly pleased. She was afraid to rejoice loudly. Everything was going too well in her life. She was used to breaking through, climbing, gnawing her teeth with tears in her eyes. And her aunt said that there were plenty of envious eyes around, and they were not even necessarily acquaintances. That's how you rejoice, and some offended by life lady on the street spit and wishes you nasty things. So it is better to be quiet, but be sure that happiness will not go anywhere. The girl told me how she had settled down. She unobtrusively asked about Matthew, but Tiana did not refuse. They saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. Matthew would stop by her place of work before his shift in a cab. They would sit in the corner of the store like a pair of canaries. Oberon had once scolded Matthew for interfering with Tiana's work, but then waved it off, seeing the boys' glances at each other. Tiana hated to let him go every time, but she was afraid to say so. The range of emotions around Matthew was off the charts. She felt like a fool when he explained some historical facts with an important look. Then she was embarrassed and blushed. If he brought her goodies and small nice gifts, she sank in his eyes as in a cup of fragrant tea. Once he waited for her after the store closed. They drove around town all evening, and then Matthew handed her a neat bouquet. Never had any man treated her so simply and tenderly at the same time, not counting her aunt. But here was different. There was care, a twinge of shyness, a fear of offending, a desire to protect and shelter her under his wing. Tiana could feel it all without words. She'd once tried to start a conversation about thanking him for helping her with her job and housing. But Matthew put his finger to his lips and smiled. She was drawn to him more and more each day. When Tiana went to the village, she missed him especially. She wanted to put her arms around him, snuggle her nose into his chest, and be silent. Smiling in love, she finally remembered that you can live and work not only for someone or for the sake of someone, but also just for yourself. Of course, Tiana never stopped sending her aunt money and worrying about her health. But for the first time, she realized that she could exhale and slow down a bit. That there were simple everyday joys, that you didn't have to run ahead, and sometimes you could even let yourself relax. October was over, and rainy, cold November came, followed by December. But not everyone was in the same gloomy mood. In Matthew's mind, the sun was shining all the time, whether he was in classes or driving to work. Time dragged on, but with Tiana, it flew by like a blink. His mother was behind him, or pretended to be. He didn't really care. Matthew didn't respect or love her any less. He just realized it was time to protect his personal space. Funny how it was only meeting the girl from the village that put things in perspective. Before, he had waited anxiously for his parents' approval and worried about her every no, even though he found an alternative. Matthew also realized that his mother would definitely not approve of his affair with Tiana. Not now, anyway. That's why he hid the girl's presence in every possible way. Why create unnecessary conflicts? When the time came, he'd introduce them for real. Toward the end of the year, every accountant is overwhelmed. You have to make reports, summarize all the documents, add up debit and credit. And, as is always the case, some certificates and forms were missing. Nayli had to send a couple of graduate students to lead the way, and herself to search for the necessary papers. She preferred to do everything in advance. There were enough examples around of those who procrastinated until the last-minute, sleepy students turning in their tails, and young professors cursing the university's bureaucratic system while trying to fill out all the journals in a day before an audit. Why do people have such a lack of respect for numbers? After all, you just have to start and everything in life goes according to plan. Someone will stop being late, someone will find out where most of their money goes, and someone will make an informed decision, Nayli thought. On their head, like a perfectionist, everything was in order. Accounting, Alex's student house. Matthew's shelf was empty. Outwardly, everything was the same, and she couldn't charge anything to her son based on maternal suspicion alone. But that same instinct told her that her son had changed. More precisely, he stopped listening to her. Break. All the shelves in the study. Nayli realized she had to go to the university dormitory. The necessary documents were bound to be there with the commandant. At first, Nayli had thought of sending a young assistant to the dormitory, but then something compelled her to go herself. And, as it turned out, for good reason. As soon as she came around the corner, she saw a familiar car in the parking lot in front of the dormitory. Matthew was standing next to it, reverently embracing a girl in an unremarkable gray jacket, but with a bright green scarf. The head accountant lurked around the corner like a detective. Then she took out her cell phone and snapped a couple of pictures. "So this is the mouse responsible for all my son's changes," the woman whispered, peering at Tiana through the panes of her glasses. At first, Nayli wanted to give her offspring a beating right there in the parking lot. But experience told her to be more subtle. She'd already kept more than one skirt away from her boy. It would be easy to deal with a skirt like that. Nayli even hid her face from all pictures of her son. It seemed to her the most disgusting prank. The woman waited until the couple had left, and with a determined look, she made her way to the commandant's office. "First, I decided to get all the necessary paperwork, and then to nail the guardian of the peace of the dormitory to the wall with personal questions. I've got a truant student who lives here. I want to talk to her." Nayli began from afar as the papers were already in her bag. "Whoever we find will be punished." The commandant, who liked to show off to the faculty on occasion, was keenly interested. True, this did not prevent him from covering student parties and absences for a small payoff. But here's the trouble. I don't remember the name and I've only seen it once, but here's a photo. Help me find this shameless one." Nayli shoved her phone under the commandant's nose, where Tiana's face was clearly visible. He turned up his nose predatorily, but then faltered, like a hound mistaking an empty tin can for a partridge. "Not ours exactly," he shrugged. "What do you say? Why don't you send an inspection down here? Have you had an accounting for a long time?" And repairs. Nayli raised one eyebrow expressively. "I'm a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience." The commandant's eyes flickered. He was choosing the lesser of evils. Considering that some of the public property was written off, or sold, and the pipes and electrics were kept on duct tape and word of honor, he didn't need any inspections. He needed to get the full because of the mess in the dormitory, or to get a little because of the lieutenant. The choice was obvious. "But actually," said the commandant, "she lives in room 302, but it is temporary, at the request of a relative from the village." Only then he realized that the girl in question could not be a student, which meant that she had not been truant. But it was too late. "Apparently the law doesn't apply to you," said Nayli. Apparently an audit wouldn't hurt after all. The head accountant adjusted her glasses, turned to the door, and walked out. By evening, Nayli knew everything about Tiana: who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in the dormitory, and how she had gotten there. The story of a village girl with no education who was trying desperately to get a foothold in the city had set things straight. The woman realized that she was not wrong in her premonitions. She made a couple of calls and hung up the receiver of the working landline phone on the lever in satisfaction. Matthew looked at the time. It was almost 7 p.m. Tiana would be finishing work in half an hour. The young people agreed to go for a walk. The weather was just right. It was snowing without wind. The city seemed to be covered with a downy shawl. The guy took a couple of cups of coffee, Tiana's favorite chocolate, and went along a familiar route. But going into the store, saw instead of Joy crying girl and consoling her Oberon. "Nothing, Tianushka. I can wait until you get settled again." The kind pet store owner stroked Tiana's back. "What's wrong?" Matthew rushed over to them, not forgetting his coffee, which he nearly spilled. "Everything's gone. They evicted me from the dormitory." Tiana wiped away her tears. "They said only students could live there." "Well, why am I surprised? I'm the one who sat down." Matthew berated himself. "You should have found another place to live a long time ago. Where's the stuff? Is it in the warehouse over there? Oberyn nodded at the door behind the cash register. It's not your fault, Tiana said. I'm the one who got too relaxed. Let's go. Let's try to do something. Matthew took the bags from behind the door. Aunt Abby, if Tiana doesn't work for a couple of days, nothing will happen. Oh, come on, Matthew. The woman waved her hand. Well, I'm not human, am I? Of course I'll wait. Besides, you can't throw away such workers. Tiana looked at her employer with grateful eyes, and then at Matthew, who was already holding her jacket. Come on, Eagles, you've got work to do. Oberyn admonished them before they left. The snow was still circling in the air, falling carelessly, dancing. Next to Matthew, Tiana immediately became calmer. He certainly wouldn't let her stay out at night. They got into the car, stowed their bags. We'll check into a hotel tonight, and tomorrow we'll find you an apartment, he said. But let's stop by my place. I think I left my car papers in my room. If the police stop me, I don't want to pay a fine. Sure, let's go. Tiana nodded and unconsciously hugged Matthew's arm. While they reached their destination, they called several hotels and very soon found a free and inexpensive room. They could exhale a little. As the car pulled into the driveway, Tiana's cell phone suddenly rang. She thought that it was the hotel receptionist, so she picked up the phone without looking at the screen. After a couple of minutes, the phone slipped out of her hands and fell on the seat. What? Who called? Matthew saw Tiana sit up with a determined face and saw her eyes fill with tears again. Auntie's been taken to the hospital, Tiana muttered with wooden lips. It was the neighbor who called the ambulance. Matthew pulled her to him and hugged her. Why is all this coming down on you? He stroked her hair and felt her shaking with sobs and tears. And Tiana was crying again, only out of helplessness. She had only just begun to believe in miracles as life brought her harshly back to reality. Matthew, it's okay. It's going to be okay. Calm down. Let's go to your aunt's. What hospital did they take her to? Matthew started fumbling in the armrests. In the meantime, have a drink. Tears won't help, but your eyes will hurt. He took out a plastic bag of pills and a bottle of mineral water. And then what they call a fatal accident happened. Tiana swallowed the pills and began coughing desperately. Matthew, in a panic, rushed to pound the girl's back and search for water around the car. But there was no more. He realized that just a little more, and they would have to go to the hospital for another reason. There was no choice but to go up to the apartment to get a glass of water. Matthew flew into the kitchen without taking off his shoes and immediately met the surprised gaze of Nayli's mother. All she could see was her son rushing back into the hallway with the hair dryer and the glass, and that there was someone coughing desperately. A few seconds later, the eyes of the unofficial mother-in-law and daughter-in-law met, the former's full of contempt, arrogance, and disgust, the latter's frightened and confused. Why did you bring this here? Nayli didn't even bother to call Tiana anything other than it. Mom, can't you see? Is she sick? Matthew stood up for his friend. I see the chief accountant wrinkled her nose squeamishly, and she wants to get a better job at your expense. Matthew stepped between his mother and Tiana. You've lost the last vestiges of your humanity with your numbers, he said, putting his back to the girl. No, son. You've lost your mind. Nayli raised her hand and poked Tiana with her finger. That girl's just a country girl. She'll move in, get pregnant, saddle you up in our apartment, and make money out of you. Tiana felt dizzy, whether from the fact that she could breathe normally at last or from the words of this scary woman hitting her like a rod. I'd rather lose my mind with her than go on living with you on a leash, Matthew said, pulling Tiana close to him. Matthew turned his back to his outraged mother and hugged Tiana, who was trembling with shock. And out they went. To the hospital, the young people drove in silence. The girl no longer had the strength for emotions, and the guy was ashamed in front of her. In the hospital, Tiana barely made her way through the nurses to Aunt Ida's room. The woman was unexpectedly cheerful and was discussing something with another patient. Auntie? Tiana looked at her with a mixture of joy and bewilderment. The old woman went into the cellar and slipped on the last step. I went tumbling. Aunt Ida began to tell her story so contagiously cheerful that everyone present involuntarily smiled. I was sitting on a pile of potatoes. My leg was curled up. Somehow my neck, the crown, and the soup fell out. I got up somehow. Our neighbor went into the barn. I called out to her. And that's how I ended up here. Oh, Aunt Ida. Do you know how to scare? Tiana laughed and hugged the woman. It's a sprain. They put a plaster cast on me, covered the abrasions with green, but left them. Aunt Ida nodded at the pile of papers on the nightstand next to Tiana's familiar mother. Tiana was immediately relieved. She was happy that everything had worked out. Neither lost housing nor nasty words could be more important than the love of those closest to her. Matthew's head poked into the room. He was tired of tramping down the hall. Come in, young man." Aunt Ida waved her hand invitingly, a little embarrassed. "Your guests. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Tiana introduced them to each other. In a couple of minutes, the conversation was already flowing animatedly. It was so easy and relaxed for all three of them, as if they were not in a hospital room, but on the veranda of a country house on a Saturday sunset. They chatted until the nurse asked the visitors to leave, as the time had passed 22. "We'll come tomorrow," Tiana promised. Come. Just the two of you," Aunt Ida winked at them both approvingly. When Matthew didn't come home the first night, Nayli had treated it as a whim. When Matthew didn't show up the second, third night either, Nayli began to worry. And when one day some of his things disappeared, she realized that the usual order had been broken. In the mind of a woman who had spent her life measuring by numbers, what had happened was incomprehensible. The unfortunate broken cup came to mind. On the fourth day, Nayli caught Matthew in the corridor of the university. "When are you coming home?" she asked him sternly but worriedly. "I'm fine," Mom Matthew replied distantly and coldly. "Don't be nervous." He pulled his elbow out of his mother's palm and headed off to his next class. Matthew and Tiana rented an apartment. A neighbor looked after the household in the village. There, in that tiny room of an old 5-story building, Matthew felt as cozy and good as he had never felt anywhere else. He already knew that this girl would definitely become his wife. Her inner world, her childlike directness, her marvelous sense of beauty charmed him. Her borscht cutlets could compete with restaurant dishes, an affectionate embrace in the evenings energized and relaxed at the same time. Tiana stopped by Aunt Lexi's hospital every day before work. Tiana had a fiancé. Aunt Lexi laughed. "What a fiancé?" Tiana waved away the beet red Tiana. "I'm old, but I'm not bad." "I see that you both bloom like a flower on a May afternoon," the woman said good-naturedly, patting her stepdaughter on the head. Matthew smiled at the words, for they were true. When Aunt Lexi was discharged, the young men took her to the village. The elderly woman, limping but alert, joked constantly. From that day on, Matthew began going to see her with Tiana almost constantly. He liked the village atmosphere, the peace and tranquility. He had never had any relatives in the countryside, so everything was a wonder. The young man looked at the house and yard with keen interest, zealously brushed the snow, and constantly found something to do that required a man's hand. He changed the faucet, insulated the wiring, rehung the doors on the kitchen cabinets. Walk with the one, Aunt Lexi elbowed Tiana while standing in the hallway. "Tired of planting potatoes and digging beds in the spring," Tiana said. "I'd love to." Matthew crawled out from under the sink with a wrench, and Tiana laughed. Periodically, the couple's idyll in the village or in the apartment was broken by Nayli's phone calls. She asked Matthew to come back, shouted at him, threatened him, begged him, but the boy was adamant. Yes, it was hard to combine studying, working in a cab, and traveling out of town. On weekends, I had to deny myself something to pay the rent. But it was better than living under orders and constant control. "Mom, I'm fine." "Don't be so nervous," Matthew answered with the usual phrases without appealing to his conscience. Neither entreaties nor even tears could make him become comfortable and proper by his mother's standards again. In the end, Matthew began to be at home, but for a tick, and kept his new address a secret. He never refused help, but he kept his distance and continued to assert his personal boundaries. Nayli's anger was replaced by jealousy powerlessness, and it flowed into resentment. Colleagues said different things who scolded the village girl, who suggested to get away from his son. But all agreed in one thing: at such a young age, so nervous will not do any good. Several months had passed since mid-April. Spring burst into town with cherry blossoms and the scent of the first daffodils. Nayli, though tired, could not fully accept the fact that her son lived apart. One warm day, when the sun was almost summertime, the accountant returning from work sat down on a bench in the lilac bushes. Usually Nayli never sat on it with her neighbors, considering it beneath her dignity to watch passers-by. But today her new shoes rubbed her foot, and she had no choice. Daniel, an elderly neighbor, came out of the entryway, leaning on a stick. He was a quiet old man who lived on the first floor, tended the flower beds, fed the birds, and never bothered anyone. "It's a beautiful day today," he greeted Nayli, lifting his old-fashioned hat. "Terrible. My feet are all blistered," she mumbled back. "My son's been on my nerves since winter. Work's a mess. It's not beautiful. Feet will heal. Work is not a wolf. And I can fix my son," Daniel shouted and went about his business. "He left his mother. Dumped her," Nayli grumbled. "I was like you when I was young." Nayli, the neighbor, suddenly changed his tone. "I also scolded my daughter for falling in love early. She married a tailor instead of a military man." Nayli, who had a lot of unfriendly thoughts swirling around in her head, suddenly had them scattering like sparrows from a bush. "And nothing. She's graduated from the institute, teaches dancing to kids. Happy. Her eyes are shining. And now I'm happy about my granddaughter, Nayli. I took her to the circus when she was little. Now she's running from school with a certificate. Grandpa. She's all grown up now." Daniel sat down on the bench next to Nayli. "What does this have to do with my son?" she asked in bewilderment. "It has to do with the fact that you have to let your children go in time, that you can't make a bed for them everywhere. So let them make their own mistakes and learn their own way. You want it better, but can he have it better in his head?" The old man looked at Nayli carefully. "How could he know?" the woman began. The old man interrupted her and looked into her eyes clearly, but slightly sternly. "Do you want to see your grandchildren?" There was something in that look that made Nayli's inner rebel surrender, embarrassed, hide in a far corner. "I do," she said, barely audibly. "And if you keep fighting with your son, you won't see it." Daniel folded his hands on the hilt of his cane. "It's about time he flew out of the nest and made his own. Is he a boy? Let's go." Nayli sighed. The elderly neighbor simply and without ceremony revealed the truth that she had feared all her life and did not want to admit that her son would grow up sooner or later, that he would not replace her husband. Life really isn't just about numbers and controlling every event around her. Nayli turned all suitors away, fearing they would take up her living space, and ended up alone. She drove the girls away from her son, and he still chose the one he liked. She did not spare even the students, even though they diligently studied her subjects and were afraid of absences. She only pointed, controlled, criticized, seeking to fill the void in her own soul. No matter how you look at it, it's a beautiful day. Daniel drew in air noisily and shouted happily, pointing to a tree. "Look, a tit." He watched the bird with interest. Nayli nodded and smiled. The black and white bird hopped about the branches with a stick in its beak. At one point it dropped its find, made a loud squeak, and then flew to the ground, picked up the wand and flew away with it. Tiana and Matthew gathered in the village in the early morning of May 1st to help Aunt Lexi with chores for the holiday, cleaning up the grounds, planting vegetables. In the evening the plan was kebabs, baked potatoes, and a picnic. The young people had already left the house and were packing their bags with things in the car. Suddenly Matthew was called by a familiar voice. He turned around. "Mom, how are you here?" He was surprised. "I mean, how did you find me?" Tiana froze in front of the car. She was overcome by the echoes of that nasty feeling, when in winter she stood on the doorstep of a stranger's apartment and listened to nasty things about herself. "Old friends," helped Nayli answered. "I wanted to talk about everything that had happened." Her mother's voice was unaccustomedly soft, not dictatorial. There was a hint that she was holding them back. Or maybe it was something else. Mom, if you're talking about the same thing again, my decision hasn't changed. Matthew grabbed his bag of things. No, son, Suddenly tears came out of Nayli's voice and she began to wipe them away with her fingers. Tiana and Matthew were hurrying Tiana to get her out of her stupor, and Matthew because he had never seen his mother cry in his life. There were times he wondered if she was even capable of it. The boy hastily put his arm around the woman and began to soothe her. Don't cry, Mom, everything is fine. What's wrong? Oh, Matthew, son, I have so much to tell you. Nayli turned to Tiana, and to apologize to you. Come with us to the village. Matthew looked at his mother. We'll rest, we'll sit, we'll get to know everyone. It's a holiday, it's spring. He nodded to Tiana, and she tilted her head in agreement, showing that she supported the idea. Aunt Lexi took the unexpected guest's visit well. Tiana had never told her about what had happened between her and her chosen one's mother, so the acquaintance was easy and relaxed. Nayli and Aunt Lexi found common ground surprisingly quickly and began discussing recipes while sitting at a table in front of the porch. Matthew had pulled the table from the kitchen in anticipation of the evening's gatherings. The women tried to help the young men clean up the grounds, but they only waved their hands. Why are you staring at your mom like you're seeing her for the first time? Tiana nudged Matthew lightly with her elbow as they cleaned up last year's dry leaves and branches from the vegetable garden. I saw her for the first time. The young man leaned his gloved hands on the handle of the rake. Not a real one. How is this woman different from the one who all my childhood fed me porridge, according to the regimen, scolded me for being 2 minutes late? By evening, when all the pressing matters were over, the kebabs were fried and the table was set, the small group finally sat down together. Nayli, who had traveled light from the city, covered herself with a fur shawl. Aunt Lexi got the house wine, set out the best appetizers. She'd even laid a festive white tablecloth, which everyone had persistently discouraged her from doing. When, if not tonight, the stubborn hostess diligently straightened the corners and smoothed the pattern in the center. Tiana turned on the antique radio, which, like a grasshopper, stuck its long antenna whiskers out the window, and the chatter of the presenters and retro songs came on. The evening became especially soulful when it got dark, and some smooth melody played on the airwaves. Nayli suddenly rose from the table, glass in hand. I want to apologize, she began, taking a deep breath. First and foremost to you, Tiana. I behaved abominably. I apologize for my rudeness, my arrogance. I can see that my son is happy with you, and for any mother, that is what matters most. Tiana smiled with one eye at Nayli's mute question. As she continued, I want to apologize to you, Matthew. I've tried to be the best mother for you, to replace your father and grandparents. But in this list of duties and discipline, I forgot about the simple moments of warmth, childhood joys, and your dreams. Forgive me, my boy. She discreetly took the napkin from her son's hands and blotted her wet eyes again. Mother, you'd better stop it. There's no need to apologize. Matthew took the woman's hand. No, I know what I'm saying, Nayli interrupted him. She looked at Aunt Lexi. And I want to apologize to you too. Why should I apologize? The hostess splayed her hands, nearly knocking over the decanter. To you and all the people who live in the villages. I always thought of them as second class, uneducated and stupid. I see now that I was terribly mistaken. It was only in my old age that I realized the blinders I'd been wearing all my life. Nayli exhaled and drank all that was in the glass in a gulp. Oh, what a useless girl you are. We need a vegetable garden, and we have rattles in our hands. Aunt Lexi scolded her. But since tonight is such an evening, I have something to say, too. Matthew looked around at the crowd. The first news is that I've been hired as a paralegal. After the semester ends, I'm going to start practicing my profession. The second, he turned to Tiana, who was all animated with anticipation. For her, the news of the paralegal was indeed a surprise. But the real surprises were ahead. Tiana. Matthew turned to her with his whole body. I'd like to believe that a girl like you wouldn't give up the humble burden of being a lawyer's wife. That's how it happened that night. Will you marry me? Matthew asked. Aunt Lexi opened her mouth in surprise. Nayli let a second wave of tears fall, barely recovering from her loud apology. Tiana stared in amazement at the thin dainty ring in a simple box. "I'll do it with the cab driver's husband," she exclaimed, jumped up and hugged Matthew tightly, not believing what was happening. After the hugs, congratulations, and toasts, they began a loud discussion about the upcoming wedding. Aunt Lexi said the celebration should be a village tradition. Nayli argued with her, insisting on a restaurant. Matthew intervened when the relatives got to the point of discussing the festive table. "No one is getting married yet. It's too early to plan hot salads," he calmly reassured them. "Women should plan ahead," Nayli replied. That's right, Aunt Lexi said. "What if I don't have enough pickles?" Tiana laughed out loud. Everyone else laughed too. It was past midnight when they decided to call it a night. Matthew took his mother into the house. Nayli was tired from the events, the long journey, and the revelations, so she fell asleep, barely touching her pillow. Tiana and Aunt Lexi were clearing the table. The woman suddenly froze as she carried the plates into the house. "What is it, Auntie?" Tiana asked, noticing it. "I told you that Pebble was good luck," sneaky Aunt Lexi said with a sly squint. "Now it's going to decorate the second wedding." Tiana looked at her reflection in the glass of the veranda, where her face was reflected in the bright lantern like a mirror. Her hair and earrings with Ural emeralds glistened. After selling her house in the village, Stacy reluctantly walked to her son's apartment, and when she saw the suitcase. Stacy walked down the street, struggling to move her legs. She had just returned from the supermarket where she had received her pension. The elderly woman went to the nearest grocery store. She needed to buy potatoes, some meat, and she was almost out of cereals. And also milk, flour, sugar. The bag was heavy. It hadn't been a weight for Stacy before, though. On the farm, she'd thrown hay with a pitchfork, carried huge boxes, and carried buckets full of milk or water. What a lot of things she'd done. But now Stacy was a little over 70, and age, of course, was taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms weakened. She dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was offered help by passers-by and two teenagers with school backpacks on their shoulders. A middle-aged woman and a tall young guy also offered help. But Stacy refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to get anywhere. And these kind people, it was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Stacy wasn't just walking so slowly because of the heavy bag. She just didn't want to go home, and the place she was going back to wasn't what you'd call a refuge. Her house used to be spacious, bright, cozy, with a large kitchen and a stove, 4 rooms with a front garden, and a carved fence that Stacy's father had put up, with beloved friends and neighbors. Close to home was good for Stacy, though her work was hard. She spent most of her life working on the collective farm, tending the animals and cleaning the pens. She worked double shifts to make sure her son had everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs buzzed. Still, the old woman remembered those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The November cold rain fell suddenly, without warning in Philadelphia, as if someone upstairs had opened a faucet of ice water. Stacy was in a hurry. The walk seemed to be canceled. She'd have to go home. There was nowhere to go. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. "No, we can't run home. We have to wait it out." Stacy hurried to the porch of the nearest store. Here, under the canopy, she could stand until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the mischievous tiled plaza, people were gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden fall downpour was another adventure, and frowning adults, late for their business because of the rain. Stacy's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He stood with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the street. Bright birch eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hair the color of ripe wheat. A real handsome man. He'd probably get a lot of girls. He looked just like Jacob, a guy Stacy had only known for 2 days in her life. That had been almost 40 years ago. And yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Jacob, if he was still alive, had long since forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many of those had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Jacob has no idea that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. The key guy, the one Stacy was secretly watching, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger over the display. Whether he was watching a video or reading something. Young people are so dependent on these gadgets these days. Whether that was good or bad, Stacy didn't know. Her youth was very different. Stacy was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the oldest child. Her parents had another daughter named Vivi. The family lived poorly but decently. They did not starve, did not go in old clothes, and did not go to resorts. They did not buy fur coats and luxury cars. Their parents worked hard, so Stacy and Vivi learned early to help around the house. Stacy, observing modern children whom she thought were overprotective of their parents, marveled. She and her sister, at 7 or 8 years old, could already mop the floors, cook lunch and dinner. Moreover, the girls cleaned the yard, took care of the livestock, did their own homework and laundry without reminders. And after all, they did not have modern technical wonders that make life much easier: washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished their homework, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to their friends. All their peers lived the same way. They had time to do housework and at school and play with their classmates. Stacy and Vivi were always very friendly, supporting each other. Stacy has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Stacy didn't do well in school. Unlike her little sister, Vivi was a quick learner. Complex formulas were no problem for her. The complex rules of the Russian language seemed to fall into place in her younger sister's head. For Stacy, however, science remained incomprehensible throughout her schooling. She seemed to be trying to learn literacy. She always did her homework. She was not lazy. She did not slack off. But apparently the ability was not given. Vivi understood everything effortlessly. She just had a clear head. Parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone from the family will get a higher education, dreamed the mother to get into the people. Daughter, reasoned the father, you have a head on your shoulders. It's foolish to miss such a chance. You do your best, and we'll help you. Stacy was proud of her sister too, but it hurt her to hear her parents say that. It turned out that her parents really hoped more for Vivi and expected her to succeed in her studies and career. They didn't count on Stacy for that. Vivi tried hard, studied hard, and never bullied her sister. On the contrary, she helped Stacy with her lessons. When Stacy was faced with assignments that were difficult for her, the sisters grew up. Stacy went to study in the city, went to college, choosing a specialty of sewing technologist. The girl has always had an aptitude for needlework. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Wright approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. The specialty is wonderful. You will not be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands. Agreed the mother. Bon voyage. After her studies, Stacy decided to stay in the city. She got a job in an atelier, rented an apartment nearby, started taking part-time jobs, and soon Stacy was supporting herself. The atelier paid a small salary, but the part-time jobs helped to make a dress, a coat, a tablecloth, or something else. Stacy did not sit without work and money. Meanwhile, Vivi was studying law at university. How proud her parents were of her success and told their acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, they were calm, hard-working. Stacy will not be lost. But they were really proud of their youngest daughter, Vivi, who was smart and beautiful, and was also studying at university. Stacy was genuinely happy for her sister. What could she do? She herself was not given to gnaw on the granite of science, but she had golden hands, and it was noted by everyone. As time went on, Stacy's friends were getting married, but it didn't seem to be working out for her. She wasn't attracted to the guys she liked, and for some reason the guys Stacy liked preferred other girls. When she heard about her friends' and classmates' weddings, Stacy worried that she might end up alone, an old maid. Her parents only added fuel to the fire, asking each time their eldest daughter arrived, when will she get married? When children? When will you settle down? Vivi's parents were in no hurry to get married. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, Vivi didn't have to worry about it. Secondly, she was still in school. and after graduation she was going to go to graduate school. Her parents saw her in their dreams as a university teacher or even a professor. From the eldest, Stacy, they just expected human happiness, to meet a cheerful, good-natured husband, to have favorite grandchildren. Stacy was almost desperate. She looked at every guy in her neighborhood as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such obsession did not go unnoticed and scared men away. Once there was a dance at the House of Culture. Stacy went there with her friends. She didn't like dancing very much, and loud music gave her a headache. But you could meet someone at the dance. Galia, her friend, found a husband there. They were living together now, expecting their first child. Stacy wanted the same, the love of a husband, a child, simple human happiness. She put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing her slender legs, curled her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips. After looking at herself in the mirror and being satisfied, she slipped out of the house. Stacy didn't have much hope for anything, because she went to the dance once every 2 or 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night was different, magical, amazing. Jacob had noticed one of Stacy's friends, Penelope, a blue-eyed beauty. He approached their company, seemed to be getting to know everyone, but kept his eyes on Penelope. Stacy realized she was missing. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, merry, mischievous, and sly, and his smile that would drive anyone crazy, she fell in love. Jacob was witty and fun to talk to. He felt confident, not embarrassed, unlike so many of the other guys in Stacy's company. And she herself, of course, was mesmerized by him. Stacy envied Penelope. She wished that this young man was looking so interested in her, and not her friend. She would have given a lot for that. But Jacob asked Penelope one dance, then another. Stacy watched them enviously from a distance. She saw the boy try several times to hold Penelope tighter to him than was proper. His hands kept slipping below her waist. Penelope, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Stacy didn't understand her. What was all this modesty and childish behavior? They were adults, they had already graduated, they were working. After another dance, Penelope slipped outside for some fresh air. Stacy understood that. She had been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she'd found an excuse to run away. Stacy had been watching the couple all evening and could see what was going on. Jacob hurried after his lady, but Stacy got in his way. Slow music was playing. "Shall we dance?" Stacy smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Stacy had never acted like this before. But now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. There was no doubt in her mind that Jacob would agree to dance with her. And so he did. He stared at Stacy for a moment, as if trying to remember who she was. But of course, Jacob had only been looking at Penelope when he met her. He didn't care about the others, but the next second he was smiling radiantly at Stacy, making her heart race and her palms sweat. And he held out his hand to her. They danced in each other's arms. Stacy melted in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it wasn't the first kiss in Stacy's life, but she had never had that reaction before. Stacy felt dizzy and her eyes darkened. She wished Jacob could hold her like this for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them watch, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who thought of her. "Why don't we go for a walk?" Jacob suggested in a slightly husky voice. Stacy was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him too. They walked through the city at night, holding hands. Jacob said something about himself, then asked Stacy questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he offered to go to her. Stacy agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Stacy played a very pleasant role for herself. She imagined that she and Jacob were husband and wife who loved each other and were going to live together for the rest of their lives. It was a pleasure to be near this man, to take care of him. How happy was it to fall asleep next to the one she loved? Jacob was already asleep, but Stacy lay there, staring at the ceiling, savoring the warmth of a loved one. His peaceful breathing, the silence, the stillness. Just the two of them. Magical. Stacy realized she was in love like she had never been in her life. She never knew she was capable of such feelings. Stacy didn't know much about Jacob. He told her he lived in another city. Which city, he didn't mention. He'd tell her tomorrow. Guy came here to visit a friend. They were in the army together. This coworker had a wedding recently, so he invited Jacob. Witnesses like Jacob's leaving soon. But now everything's changed. They've met each other. Jacob isn't going anywhere, and if he does, he'll probably take her with him. The way he'd been looking at her all night. Those looks were the spark that had ignited between them, and that rarely happens. How lucky they were to meet each other at the dance. In the morning, Stacy woke up to someone rattling pans in the kitchen, but caught the scent of scrambled eggs. Stacy stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It's Jacob. He's making them breakfast. How wonderful and romantic this is. Before meeting her lover, Stacy peeked into the bathroom. She washed her face, lightly brushed her hair to look casual, touched up her lipstick and lightly pinched her cheeks, causing a blush. She wanted to look her best in front of Jacob. He'd made her scrambled eggs, and there was ham frying in the skillet. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Nothing, I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Stacy smiled radiantly. Breakfast almost in bed. How romantic. "Why don't you come on? I'll take care of you." Jacob took out a plate, deftly placed a piece of scrambled egg on it, and sprinkled greens on top. Stacy watched his every move as if mesmerized. Her heart beat joyfully in her chest. She had finally met her man. And what a man. Beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. They ate breakfast in silence. Jacob seemed pensive. He was obviously thinking about something, and Stacy didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for tonight," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Layton's, pack my things, and get to the train station. The train's coming." Stacy felt like she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? What about her? I mean, they're so happy, so cozy together. "Are you leaving already?" she asked in a distressed voice. "Didn't I tell you?" Jacob was surprised. Then he smiled his charming smile. "Yeah, well, we didn't have much to talk about last night." "I thought you were staying," Stacy admitted. "I would have." "You're great, aren't you? But the train's in 3 hours and there's a lot to do. We'll see each other again." Stacy struggled to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She'd already figured it out from Jacob's look and his tone. It was an illusion, their feelings and sparks. The situation that Stacy and Jacob found themselves in was fairly typical and common. They obviously had different expectations for this encounter. For Jacob, it was an easy one-night adventure with no commitment. He was honest and didn't intentionally deceive Stacy. He just didn't specify all the details because of the romantic atmosphere. On the other hand, Stacy fell in love very quickly and began to build illusions about a serious relationship and a future together. She herself invented a beautiful love story, although Jacob did not promise anything like that. When the truth came out, it was a painful disappointment for Stacy. But she'd done the right thing, not to make a scene, but to keep her dignity. Jacob had been good in his own way too, apologizing, explaining the situation, and not making empty promises. In this kind of casual romance, it is important to be sober about the situation and the expectations of both parties. Avoid naive illusions and do not build air castles. But if feelings have awakened, do not be ashamed of them or suppress them. The main thing is to maintain respect for yourself and your partner. Accept the situation as it is. Extract from it a positive experience, not bitterness of resentment. Life goes on, and new love adventures and meetings may be waiting ahead. The situation Stacy finds herself in is indeed a difficult one. An unexpected pregnancy after a casual liaison puts before her a difficult choice, on which her whole future life depends. On the one hand, she dreams of motherhood, and at her age this may be her last chance to have a child, plus a child from a man for whom she had warm feelings. Igor has shown himself to be an attentive and caring man, albeit for a short time. On the other hand, Jacob is clearly not expecting and not ready for fatherhood after a fleeting affair. Raising a child alone will be very difficult, both morally and financially, and the pregnancy itself in her position a great stress. To make a decision on abortion is also not easy. In addition to ethical worries, it can negatively affect health and further fertility. In such a situation, it is very important to soberly consider all options, listen to your heart, but also objectively assess your strength and capabilities. Consult with close people who can support. And having made a decision, do not torture yourself with doubts and guilt. No matter how difficult the situation may be, life goes on. Perhaps in the future Stacy will have the opportunity to become a mother under more favorable circumstances. Or maybe this experience will help her better understand her true desires and priorities. The main thing is to move forward, drawing strength from her informed choices. Stacy had never met one before at all. She couldn't think of a better candidate for fatherhood. No, of course, Jacob won't be involved in the baby's life. He wouldn't even know he existed. No way. They'll never meet again. And yet, such a heredity. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Stacy felt she couldn't get rid of the baby, even with the hardships that threatened her. The fate of a single mother is unenviable, but it's better than being all alone. Having no children at all is even worse. In general, Stacy hesitated for a while and then made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession. Parents, in case of anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable. So the baby will be. The decision has been made. Stacy felt inner peace and began, at last, to really enjoy the life, rapidly developing under her heart. At this time, Vivi, the younger sister, had finished graduate school and received her degree. Not only that, she was invited to work overseas for a large company doing research. This was something incredible in Stacy's eyes. Vivi, her little sister, had made it to such heights. A dizzying career, interesting work, recognition awaited her. And she, Stacy, would soon be a single mom. Her parents talked of their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Vivi again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy that she was about to become a single mom. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Stacy was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Vivi drove away. She called her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters with pictures in them. Vivi had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made the girl even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, just a dream. And Stacy had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, they figured it out. The boss wasn't particularly happy that one of his seamstresses was going on maternity leave. Now he was nagging Stacy about her work and kept insinuating that she wouldn't be welcome at work because a single mom would be taking sick leave all the time. Who would have to work then? All of this was unsettling to Stacy. She understood that the case is going to be dismissed because the labor code carefully protects pregnant employees. But there are always loopholes, so the boss found one. One day he simply closed the attire, terminating its existence. Accordingly, all female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss took the dressmakers back to their old jobs. All except Stacy. A pregnant employee and then a single mom with a small child were of no use to the boss. Stacy was out of work and destitute. She had no savings. She couldn't even pay her rent. Nowhere to go. Stacy had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Her mother and father were surprised to hear her daughter's story, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Do not worry, we'll get through," her father soothed, stroking Stacy's head like a little girl. "We won't fall through. It's not those times. We'll be fine," echoed the mother. "You have a baby, we'll help raise it. Children are happiness." Her parents didn't seem bothered by the difficulties ahead or the inevitable gossip from the neighbors. Stacy understood why this was the case. They had a successful youngest daughter. Even Stacy's life mistakes paled in comparison to Vivi's accomplishments. On the one hand, it made life easier for the mother-to-be, but on the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Vivi's background, Stacy was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. At the due date, Stacy's son Ben was born. The new mother spent hours looking at his red, wrinkled face, trying to see if he looked like Jacob. She wanted him to look like his father, to be as handsome, as charming, as charismatic. It didn't work. Ben didn't have those deep birch eyes or the open smile that made his cheeks dimple. Ben was just an ordinary boy, short, skinny, black-haired, like his grandfather. Stacy was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's good looks, but it didn't affect her feelings for the little boy in any way. Stacy adored Ben. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, all her life would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Ben was a baby, Stacy was supported by her parents. How could they not? Government payments are minimal, no husband, no savings, no job in sight. Who wants an employee with a baby in her arms? So the parents fed both their daughter and their adored grandchild. Stacy didn't want to be on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer. Ben was too young for kindergarten. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They were very fond of him. But Stacy decided to work. After all, her baby needed the best toys, the best clothes, the best travel. She accepted that Ben was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. To make a good living, she had to work double shifts, but at least Stacy had money. Now she went into town with Ben every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the movies, and of course visited toy stores. Stacy often let her son choose what he wanted: expensive radio-controlled cars, imported construction equipment, huge sets of soldiers. Stacy literally bent over backwards at work for this, but most importantly, the happy gleam in her only child's eyes. "Why do you shake your head sometimes?" Dad asked. "You can't do that. Everything is for Ben. You forget about yourself. And you're still young." "I don't want anything," Stacy shrugged. "I just want my son to be happy." "Son, it's time you taught him to work," teased his father. "He doesn't clean up his plate or his room." The grandmother objected. "You do everything for him." Spoiled the boy. "It's not good for him. It's not good for a man." No, Stacy's mother intervened. "A loving grandmother will still have time to teach him to work. Let him enjoy his childhood for now." Stacy fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Her father just waved his hand at the women's arguments and silently went outside. Sometimes he would say something like, "Can't you argue with me?" Stacy was annoyed by her father's behavior at the time. It wasn't until a decade later that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Stacy hadn't seen or noticed much. Now they're reaping the rewards. Ben grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, he'd grasped everything quickly at first and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Stacy hoped he'd taken after his Aunt Vivi. She already held a position in the scientific academy, published in journals, and was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles. But it is impossible to ride out all the school years on one cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. That's what Ben didn't want to do. And the problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Ben gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job without education. And Stacy's heart was bleeding from the fact that her son was wasting his abilities in such a stupid and talentless way. The strict grandfather tried to educate his stubborn grandson. This time the mother and grandmother did not interfere with him, kept aside. But it was too late. For Ben, there were no more authorities. The boy got mixed up with a bad bunch of teenagers from dysfunctional families. Stacy talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Ben was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "But what can you teach me?" he questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You have no education. All your life you worked on the farm for pennies. Your parents should have brought you up." By example, you know. "I don't want a life like yours," Ben said to Stacy's mother. "Your example wasn't a good one. There are other ways." Stacy had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that he would be all right, that he would grow up and wise up. The year Ben was to graduate from high school, Stacy experienced many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father passed away. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing, but he'd written it off as a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance didn't even make it to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Ben went wild. The man, though elderly, had kept him in check. Now it's like he's got no breaks. He could disappear nights with new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for entertainment. Ben became rude, abrasive, a total stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Stacy, who was still longing for her father, felt she was losing her son. And only his mother gave her hope with her words that the boy was mad because he was growing up at that age, without a father. The boy is difficult, nothing to him. He will soon calm down. I have seen a lot of such cases in my life, said the grandmother. And indeed, by the middle of the year, Ben had suddenly grown up sharply. He had just graduated from high school, had received his certificate with C's, and he had received his grades only for his past merits, and that was thanks to his mother, who at the end of the year ran after the teachers and the school administration with gifts. Ben seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, and even apologized to them. Stacy's heart sang with joy. Mom had been right. Growing up, Ben changed. I decided to go to City College to be a welder. It's a great trade, he announced. His mother and grandmother approved of his choice. They would have been happy with any decision Ben made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. Ben would learn, he would get a profession, he would have a good, settled life. He left without difficulty, went to college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Stacy breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then another blow hit. On New Year's Eve, the elderly Vivi fell ill. Fever, cough. No big deal, just the usual seasonal cold. Stacy nursed her back to health, but her grandmother got worse and worse. They called the doctor. He immediately heard wheezing in her lungs. Vivi was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of bilateral pneumonia. Stacy was scared, of course, but pneumonia is a serious thing. Only Grandma is in the hospital, under the care of doctors. Stacy didn't think anything bad, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with the terrible news that Vivi was gone. During the night, the seizures began. In just 1 year, Stacy had lost both parents, her support, her reliable rear end. It seemed to her that she had been knocked out from under her feet. She was left alone with this cruel world, with a complicated life and a difficult teenager Ben. How she wished now that Jacob, the father of her child, was there. Yes, she still remembered him fondly and lovingly. Stacy needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Vivi was far away. Sure, she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mom. But she'd go straight back to her vibrant, eventful life. And Jacob, of course, wouldn't remember Stacy anymore. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, raising his children, not even realizing that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care. Time passed. Stacy was adjusting to her new life. The son went to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to make sure Ben had everything he needed. Ben needed clothes, food, textbooks, and extra classes. The young man still needed to go out and have fun after all. It is the time of college, when, if not now. And life in the city is not cheap. Her son wasn't working yet, so Stacy did her best for her only child, bending her back and transferring most of her paycheck to Ben. Doesn't she need much? But for Ben, whose life was just beginning, Stacy wanted to provide everything he needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was oddly dreary to be in an empty house. No one to discuss the news of the day with. Ben, of course, was called almost every night. He answered his mother's questions that he was fine, always in a hurry. It was understandable, being young. Stacy took no offense, but she often felt lonely and abandoned. Edward, a former classmate who was already a widower, began courting Stacy during this period of her life. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Edward had chased Stacy with flowers and compliments. It was back in high school. Funny, Stacy recalled, insecure, ridiculous, kind of anxious, but touching. Back then, young Stacy had dreamed of guys like Jacob, handsome, stylish, smart. And Edward, he was too plain, ethereal, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Stacy was pleased by the boy's attention. It flattered her ego, to be sure. But anything serious with him was out of the question. Time passed. Edward had grown from a teenager into a rather attractive man. He married a girl a grade below him, Trixie, whom Stacy had been friends with as a child. They weren't close friends, but they often hung out together, talking, sharing secrets. Edward and Trixie's family was exemplary. They were both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Stacy was happy for her childhood friends. Edward and Trixie had a son and a daughter. They raised their children, worked, flew to the sea every summer. Full house, affluence, love, prosperity. Stacy looked at this happy couple with a smile and was happy for them and a little envious. That was the kind of family she wanted to have, preferably with Jacob. But it hadn't worked out. Except that Edward and Trixie's happiness had been short-lived. Young and seemingly healthy Trixie suddenly began to wither. She was literally melting away. She became thin, weak. Edward took his wife to hospitals trying to help her. The cause, of course, was found some complex genetic disease had debuted, but the doctors just threw up their hands and gave disappointing prognoses. There was no help. As a result, Edward was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, his son and daughter were already old enough, but still the whole village supported the inconsolable widower. Stacy even cooked dinners for the orphan family. And then the man pulled himself together and took care of the household himself. So slowly he raised the children, put them on their feet, educated them. Both of them were already working and living in the city. Edward was in no hurry to move closer to his children. His elderly parents were still in the village, so he looked after them. When Ben left for school, Stacy began to notice that Edward was around more and more often, walking her home after work, chatting about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the store. It was as if he was accidentally in her way. Stacy didn't mind this pleasant company. They talked about the news, reminisced about their childhood, laughed. One day she invited Edward to tea. He met her after work, as was his custom, and walked her to the gate. The man agreed and came in. Finally, Edward decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that he was not taking this step lightly. "Stacy, I've always liked you, you know," he said. "Well, when was that?" Stacy smiled. She hadn't realized what Edward was getting at then. It seemed to her that they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago, hadn't it? Edward agreed. Then he looked at her seriously and added, but nothing had changed since then. Stacy looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say. But the sensation of this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. It sent shivers down her spine and warmed her heart. "I've had a crush on you since I was a kid." Since the 6th grade, Edward continued. "I decided to admit it in high school. And then I backed off. I pretended I didn't care, but I didn't, and I didn't. And the truth is, I was in a lot of pain. I used to sneak looks at you, admire you. I'd get jealous if any of the guys were around. And I dreamed that when I graduated from high school, I'd get rich and come after you in a cool car. Then you'd pay attention to me." Stacy smiled. The confession seemed naive and sweet. She hadn't noticed anything. Edward smiled too, remembering his young, ambitious self. "But it didn't work out," the man continued. "I couldn't get into university. I didn't have enough brains. I studied to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I found out about you. Some acquaintances told me you lived in the city. They said you had someone. Well, I didn't doubt it. Such a beauty. How could you not have fans lining up? I bet they did." Stacy couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. "Edward, living here in the village, thought I was a horde of suitors. I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. Oh, you don't know how wrong you were." "Yes, I was a young fool." Edward grinned. "Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left." "Edward, you were under the illusion that I had a rich fiancé in town and tons of admirers. In reality, I was lonely and jealous of my married friends." "You're in town, and you have a rich fiancé who lavishes you with gifts," Edward said bitterly. "I should have checked, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? Just a driver. And you're a princess? A queen, an unattainable ideal. No match for me." Edward was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At the time, it seemed like there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, went out with friends. The world was somehow gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless. And then it suddenly became clear that the neighbor's daughter Trixie was attracted to him, to Edward. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too pretty, not too successful. Anya had gone from a skinny girl to a lovely young woman. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Trixie graduated from a teacher's college in the city and returned to her hometown. She was now teaching school, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly toward Edward that evening, returning from work. She caught up with her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. I was stunned, Edward recalled with a smile. It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her. I'd been in the same position myself. I knew how hopeful she was, how important my attention was to her. And I knew how much my indifference would throw her off. How could I do that to a fragile girl in love? Anyway, Edward and Trixie started dating, getting to know each other better and realizing every day that they were a great couple. I thought nothing good was going to happen in my life, Edward said. It was as if Trixie had pulled me out of my cocoon, showing me that happiness was still possible. Edward and Trixie married and had children. And then? Then you came back to the village, confused and pregnant, Edward said to Stacy. How I wanted to be there for you, to support you. But it was too late. We were married, and we had babies. Did you still love me then? Stacy wondered. Of course I did, Edward answered. I still do. But I couldn't show my feelings then. I already had obligations to Trixie and the children. I loved all three of them very much, and I couldn't betray my family, not even for my own happiness. Were you unhappy? Stacy asked in surprise. Edward's revelations had shaken her to the core. I couldn't say. Trixie was wonderful. I loved her in my own way, took care of her. I was good to her. But with you, even now, I can't describe how I felt and how I feel. They sat for a while longer. Edward stared at Stacy, waiting for some sign from her. She didn't understand her own feelings. She was pleased that there was someone who loved her so much. It made her feel warm. After the death of her parents, Stacy was left all alone, a son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people who cared about her, who tried to please her, who were interested in her well-being. And then there was Edward. In love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Stacy, Ben. How would he feel about this turn of events? He'd probably disapprove, say her mother had gone crazy and was having an affair in her old age. Only the desire to be with someone she cared about gradually overcame her doubts. Stacy often thought about how nice it would be if they lived together. Edward would be happy, that was for sure. And it felt good to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to try to become a couple. I'll ask you out tomorrow, Edward summarized with a smile. The dream of my youth would finally come true. It will come true. Stacy nodded like Trixie's wife. The next day they went into town. They wandered through the park, talking, sitting in cafes, and then they went to a movie theater. Edward took Stacy's hand during the movie and held it for an hour and a half until the movie was over. The woman didn't mind, she liked the feeling. She was finally not alone. A week later, Edward moved in with her. He fixed the leaky faucet and tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally squeak-free. And Stacy started cooking for herself again. She was too lazy to do it alone, but now Edward was with her, and she was making him happy with delicious meals. The only question on Stacy's mind was how Ben would feel about all this. He didn't know yet, did he? His son rarely came to visit his mother, and they talked on the phone more and more. She had been stalling, not telling Ben about the changes in her life. Edward had told both his son and daughter at once. Stacy realized they were happy for their father. She wished her own son would react the same way, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Stacy still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Hiding the details of her personal life wasn't difficult. The son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day, Ben came to visit. It was surprising. The son hadn't graced his mother with his presence for a long time, and now he showed up. Hi, Stacy was both excited and a little confused. Edward hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone else was living in the house now. Hi, Ben said glumly. He didn't look well, gaunt, pale, anxious. I need money, he said. Stacy knew right away that something serious had happened. What's going on? She asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbed in her chest. Is it something with school? I haven't studied in a long time, Ben muttered under his breath. How come? They expelled me for truancy. I've been working hard and you don't get any money, he said rudely. I sent you most of your paycheck every month, Stacy reminded him. That's good money for the city. It's nothing, Ben sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well-to-do. They have cars and apartments and money for fun. Did I feel like a beggar all the time? You think that's nice? It hurt Stacy to hear those words. She'd worked her whole life for her son. She wanted Ben to have the best of everything. And now this is what happens. He thinks he's miserable. So Stacy's not doing her job as a parent. Ben even dropped out of college. So what now? Stacy asked. Did he go into debt? I wanted to start a business, make some money, Ben explained. I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money. They're threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help, Mom. You know I ain't got nothing. What do you mean you don't have anything? Ben was surprised. What about the house? Do you want us to sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts and rent an apartment. We'll live in the city. Why are you going to take a well-deserved vacation soon? There's no couch in town, of course. But I'll get you a job in an attire. My grandmother told me that you used to be a seamstress, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in town, like we used to. Wouldn't that be nice? Stacy couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Ben's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable. But now she had Edward. They were good together. It was nice to have someone who loved and understood. And now what? Ben finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Edward's jacket hung on the wall, his pants were on the table. There were size 43 sneakers by the front door. What are those? Ben asked, looking at his mother in amazement. Did you have someone in your life? I've been wanting to tell you for a long time, Stacy said. It's just something that happened here. Ben nodded his head understandingly and sighed sadly. My personal life is getting better. Yeah, well, of course you don't have a son to worry about. You know I'm not. Stacy objected softly. She could see that Ben was depressed and in trouble. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend him her shoulder in his time of need. Who else would? Son, I'll do whatever you say. And Stacy did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. With the rest, she bought a tiny apartment in an old house on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Edward offered options, wanted to give Ben his savings. It was less than he needed, but it was still a decent amount. Stacy didn't agree. Edward shouldn't have to solve her problems. Their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in a situation like this is despicable. Stay with me, Edward asked Stacy. You're packed, your suitcases are waiting for tomorrow morning. Ben has ordered a cab for you by 10 o'clock. You know I can't, Stacy replied. I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live. But why would you want to be there yourself? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we? We were, agreed Stacy. Yes, in the few years she'd lived with Edward, the woman had grown accustomed to warmth, to caring, to understanding. It was very pleasant. They walked together in the evenings, discussing things. Edward looked at Stacy with loving eyes, and she felt happy. But now everything was different. Stacy could see that her son was not well. Too anxious, too restless. Something bad is clearly going on in his life. Yes, Ben is an adult, and Edward is partly right when he says he should be able to deal with his own problems. But when Stacy was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her problems on her own. Stacy's parents had helped her a lot in the past. Edward assured her that this was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who'd been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Stacy couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and his daughter graduated, working good jobs, with families. There was no telling how Edward would behave if one of his children was in a situation like Ben's. Stacy was also afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the house she'd spent her childhood in, she was beginning to worry about growing old. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. What would she do without a corner of her own if Ben could not be looked after? He's going to lose that apartment in the old building too. And we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe we should save his son. It's about time. He's not going to admit it himself. But when they start living together, Stacy will realize it, see it for herself. She can't leave her only child alone with his troubles and problems. Why are you so worried? Stacy smiled at Edward. It was a sad smile. The woman understood, even without the mirror. I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city's close by. Distance is no barrier to feelings. Shall we meet, socialize? Of course, Edward sighed. But it's not the same thing, you know, it's just the way life works. Stacy moved to LA and was eager to get settled into her new place. There was only one room in the apartment. It went to Ben, of course. Stacy took the kitchen. She bought herself a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the closet in the morning. Edward came often at first. They walked along the promenade, as they had before, and sat in cafes. With him, Stacy felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Edward had urged her to move in with him. But if you don't want to move in with me, let's go somewhere else, he suggested. Svetlana moved to the city to be near her son Matvey and to help him. She soon discovered that Matvey had a serious problem with alcoholism. He was drinking a lot, coming home late at night or in the morning. At first, Svetlana was very worried about her son, afraid that something would happen to him because of his drinking. But then she got used to his nocturnal strolls. Svetlana began to take care of the drunk Matvey. In the morning she brought pills, water, cleaned up after him. Matvey's alcoholism progressed. He degenerated, became stupid, aggressive, helpless. Svetlana blamed herself for her son's problems, believing that the absence of a father and Matvey's unknown origin had an impact. She speculated that Matvey's alcoholism could have been passed on genetically. Svetlana fully supported and served her son. She cooked, cleaned, and bought groceries. Matvey did not work anywhere because of his drinking and lived on his mother's full support. In general, a difficult situation is described when an elderly mother is forced to have full custody of her adult alcoholic son, having given up her personal life. The son degenerates, but the mother cannot abandon him. Ben didn't bother to work. After a while, the son started demanding money from Stacy when he didn't have enough to drink. And this happened quite often because the man earned a living by rare casual earnings, which fell out infrequently. His soul demanded alcohol on a regular basis. Stacy, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money and then tried to stop giving money. But Ben still took money from his relative. Sometimes he quietly took money out of his mother's purse. Sometimes he got his way with threats and rudeness. Stacy felt miserable and confused. Living with her own son had become a nightmare. Ben would yell at his mother, sass her for no reason. He would take her money. Therefore, the woman tried, having received a payment, to immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son has not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent. But looking into Ben's empty, embittered eyes, Stacy realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Stacy was her walks with Edward. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't talk about her life. It was embarrassing, hard. She couldn't share this misery with anyone at all. In front of others, Stacy put on the mask of a prosperous and happy woman. One day, Edward told Stacy news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. We won't be able to see each other much. Where Stacy sighed sadly. The only person she'd felt human lately was Edward, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. To the sea, to Nashville, he answered. With his son's family. You know, I'm having trouble with my lungs. The doctor told me to change the climate or else. But never mind, my son has decided to move with me. My daughter's still thinking about it. But it looks like she's going to do it too. So that's that. That's too bad, Stacy said sadly. She tried to fight the tears that had come to her eyes. Stacy, I'm begging you, please come with me. You helped your son solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. He'll figure it out on his own. He's not a little boy anymore, are you? We'll live by the sea. Imagine how happy that would be. Think about it, Edward said. Stacy realized she wasn't going anywhere. How would she leave Ben? Edward just didn't know anything about Ben's addiction. He didn't know that he hadn't been making any money for a long time. Without his mother, Ben would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Edward, knowing that her son is dying alone in a distant city? Edward was gone. Stacy took his absence hard. They called each other, texted each other. Of course, Edward sent pictures of beautiful landscapes and beckoned, still calling Stacy, telling her how good it would be together. But the woman felt responsible for the son she'd given birth to, the one she hadn't raised. So she had to be there for him, to help, to support him. Sometimes because of these thoughts, the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Stacy had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Ben continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Stacy waited nights for her son. These marginal-looking people, women, put-down men, laughed loudly in Ben's room, drinking, arguing, even fighting sometimes. When Stacy tried to talk some sense into her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person at all. And then Kate, Ben's common-law wife, showed up at the apartment. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Kate was a drinker herself. While Ben usually didn't touch his mother except when he needed money, Kate clung to her mother-in-law on and off. Eventually, she and Ben had managed to turn Stacy against her. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Kate. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Stacy every day. And she hadn't saved her son. She hadn't built a personal happiness with Edward. She could be living with a man who'd loved her all her life on the beach. Dreams, that's all. What about Ben, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life, so she must be responsible for him. Well, I guess that's her fate now. The rain had eased off considerably. Stacy took advantage of the respite to make her way to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She was delaying her return, too, because there was nowhere else to go. It looked like Kate and Ben were having company again tonight. We'd be out till morning in the only room they had. They'll be in the kitchen, of course, going to the fridge. Stacy just filled it with groceries. That's a good thing. We'll probably have to go to the store again tomorrow, if there's any money left. Stacy would lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, listening to the sounds of the party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Kate, and their guests. Going up to her floor on foot, there had never been an elevator in this old house. The elderly woman stopped. All the doors as dug in. On the landing stood her suitcases, the same one she had moved here from the village with. Stacy opened one of them. Her belongings lay there. Nothing made sense. The woman tried to open the door with her key. It didn't work. Someone had clicked the lock so it wouldn't unlock from the outside. So Stacy knocked loudly. Their bell hadn't worked in a long time. The door swung open. A happy Kate stood on the doorstep, hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Stacy asked. "Seriously, you old hag," Kate said in a luscious voice. "This is my apartment. Why on earth would I leave? It's not yours, it's Ben's. It's in his name. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're nobody here." "Then get out of here," Stacy said. Ben's head peeked out from behind Kate. "Yeah, that's what we've decided. You need to go." You don't give us a life, you're always giving us advice, Ben said. You mind your own business. Are you trying to break Kate up with me too? We'd better live separately. What are you going to live on? Stacy didn't understand. She'd long ago realized that her son had no warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. You don't know anything, do you? Kate smirked. I'm expecting a baby in a couple months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay. And then every month for the child will be paid, so we're doing great. Stacy glanced at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly was showing under the sweater, but Kate had never been particularly slender, so the woman didn't notice anything. That's news to her. Ben and Kate are having a baby. Poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby ever survive? Stacy's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby eclipsed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. It would be better to deal with her own fate. So get out of here, Kate smiled again. Son? But where am I supposed to go? Stacy turned to Ben. You can't live on the streets. You've got a boyfriend in the village. Go to him. Ben said nonchalantly, do you have somewhere else to go? I don't understand. Ben didn't know that Edward had moved to another state from where he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. And you have a rich sister who won't leave you, Kate added and slammed the door shut. Stacy picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? There wasn't a single thought in her head about where to go. Edward was far away. Vivi's sister was even farther away. No one wanted her. Lonely, abandoned, now homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. She's ashamed to even tell the people she knows how life turned out. Her own son, for whom Stacy's mother lived, kicked her out of the house. Out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the icy wind had picked up. It burned his cheeks and made his eyes water. It was rapidly getting darker. There were hardly any people on the streets anymore. Stacy was finally exhausted. She set her suitcases down at an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son, sobbed for the plight of Ben and her unborn grandson. But their own future, of course, was a source of anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, from whom to ask for help. Staying outdoors on a cold November night was a pleasure, and something would happen. A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Stacy turned around. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, thin, tight jeans, sneakers, a deep hooded sweatshirt, and eyes. Attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny little dog worried, and seemed to look at Stacy with sympathy too. His funny face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. DG was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They noticed each other right away, fell in love, got married. Digi was born when both were in their 4th year, each at his own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they didn't earn much yet. Yes, they had to live with their child in a cramped room in the student dormitory. But the couple had so much ahead of them. They dreamed, they planned, they hoped. Digi did not remember her parents at all. She saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. And then the image of her mother and father opened up in Digi's mind. Cheerful, energetic, hardworking, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. Digi's mom and dad, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. And that time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. The young couple, along with a couple of similar students, were painting the walls. And something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. In general, all 4 of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially. He made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little Deji at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage. But her father's sister, Aunt Laura, showed up. She lived in the village, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Her family couldn't be called a family. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Laura. But where to go? What would people say? She abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will stigmatize her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. That's how Deji ended up in Aunt Laura's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. Deji helped her aunt with the household chores, played outside with her children, and went to school with her friends. But no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, no trips to the amusement park. And no dresses. Deji missed the warmth of the world. Hugs, affectionate words, support. Aunt Laura wasn't strict or mean, but she was not in a hurry to surround her niece with love and care. Aunt Laura had a completely different attitude to her own children. She stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. Deji always felt like a stranger to her aunt. She realized that she grew up with the realization of her own unwantedness, and it was a heavy burden for Aunt Laura. Sometimes Deji even felt sorry for her aunt. She was so tired with her work and her own children, and now she had a niece to take care of. Deji dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated. She had always spent a lot of time studying. First, she liked to learn new things, and the girl was quite good at it. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, Deji perfectly understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, settle in the city, travel the world. For all this, she needed money. So she did her best. After school, Deji entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her life of freedom began. Finally, she was no longer a burden to anyone. Deji didn't even pay attention to guys when she was young. She firmly decided for herself first her career, then everything else. But in her last year of high school, she accidentally met Eugene. He was 8 years older. A well-established, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man came to the university to talk to the rector. Eugene had his own travel agency, and he needed intelligent interpreters. They bumped into each other outside the rector's office. Literally collided. Eugene swung the door open, took a step into the hallway, and crashed into Deji, who was walking by. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. Deji assured him with a smile that she was fine. She was amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car. And then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and Deji caught her breath. Eugene seemed to feel something too. There was a spark between the young men. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course. And in the evening, he picked up Deji, and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. Deji and Eugene's relationship quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved in with him in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. At first, Deji was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich he has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive apartment. And what is she? A girl from the village, penniless. She doesn't even have parents. An orphan from Kazan, but Eugene was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at Deji with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her presence made him happy and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, Deji realized she was expecting a baby. Confused, of course. It was too quick and unplanned. Eugene, on the other hand, was genuinely happy. His business was booming. The capital was increasing. The business was growing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking Deji's still quite flat belly. Deji had thought that Eugene would finally propose to her after the news of her pregnancy, but he was in no hurry to take her to the registry office. When she herself asked him about it when they would legalize the relationship, Eugene was genuinely surprised. What for? Well, as the child should have a full family mom, dad. And this child I will recognize legally, do not doubt. And a stamp in the passport, these are such conventions. You know I was married. And the relationship was ruined after I went to the registry office. Then there was so much trouble with the reissuance of documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions." The words of her beloved then shook Diji, but she coped with herself and accepted Eugene's point of view. Really, does it matter if there is a stamp in the passport? What mattered was that they loved each other. Darcy was born on her due date and made Diji the happiest person on earth. The young mother couldn't get enough of her daughter and couldn't believe where such a miracle had come from. Eugene was not a very attentive father. He had been distant since the birth of the child. Only Diji, blinded by the newfound happiness of motherhood, hadn't noticed it right away. One day when Darcy was just 2 years old, the man announced, I'm leaving the apartment to my daughter. I'm going to support her for the rest of her life, and I'm going to keep in touch with the baby too. But I can't live with you anymore. Sorry, I fell out of love, met someone else. It happens." Eugene walked away, leaving Diji feeling upset. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Eugene so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Eugene hadn't lied he'd kept his daughter's apartment and was faithfully paying her alimony. But Diji knew she needed to find a source of income. Eugene's money was only for her daughter. Diji needed to work. She needed to establish herself in her profession. As practice had shown, in this life you have to rely only on yourself. Diji realized that, in general, she was still very lucky. Eugene left his daughter an apartment and pays child support. It wasn't much, but it was still money. Still, the pain of the breakup lingered in her chest, and the future looked very dim. I had to get a job. But it so happened that Diji had given birth to a daughter right after the university, so she had no time to get a job. And now, with a small child in her arms and no experience, who needs her? Diji has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother. No one to look after Darcy while her mother is at work. Send her to daycare. But Darcy would get sick a lot there. An employer wouldn't like an employee who couldn't get enough of sick days. The situation appeared to be a stalemate. That November evening, Diji was contemplating her future. Diji was wondering how she would ever get a job again. Money was tight, and she had to deny herself everything. She couldn't, and wouldn't ask Eugene for more money. He had left them a whole apartment and gave them money to support their daughter. And if Diji couldn't provide for herself, that was her problem. After all, she's an adult, not a child. At that moment, Princess Mopisico, the dog Eugene had given to Diji when everything was still good with them, asked to go outside. What bad timing. It's dark and cold, and there are puddles all around. It rained a while ago, but where can we go? Princess can't wait. Darcy is already asleep in her room. She won't wake until morning, so Diji can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar and leash to Princess and went out into the November evening. Diji noticed the old woman sitting on a suitcase near the bus stop and couldn't believe her eyes. It was too strange. When she got closer, she realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. Diji's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" she asked. When Diji heard Stacy's story, she was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close family member. She couldn't imagine how Ben could do this to her mom, her own mom. Diji hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. "Let's go to my place now. You're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea. You can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Stacy had gone to live with Diji. On that cold, dark evening over a cup of hot tea, a solution took shape that suited both parties to the unusual story. Stacy now looked after the house and enjoyed spending time with little Darcy, who loved her new grandmother. Diji went to work knowing that her daughter was in safe and loving hands. Diji finally had someone to love and care for her Stacy. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. And her daughter had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Ben showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Stacy come home, appealed to her sense of family. Do you value strangers more than your own son? It happened. Stacy shook her head. I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family. And I'm not strangers with Digi anymore. Ben kicked Kate out. Their baby was never born. Kate, being pregnant, wasn't about to give up her bad habits. Naturally, her body couldn't take it one day. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and sickly boy. He did not survive. The poor baby's parents' plans for a government welfare check fell through. So Ben came crawling back to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time Stacy was firm. No. Edward was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy an apartment in the city and pay off his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Edward, Stacy told him her story after all. She'd gotten over herself. It made her feel better, and Edward finally understood her. He went to Stacy's house, met Digi and Darcy. The four of them had hit it off. It was a nice, warm group of people. Darcy even started calling Edward grandfather. He didn't mind. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy it. Before Edward left, he invited her over. I look forward to seeing all three of you this summer. No refusal. No refusal is planned. Stacy smiled. Edward was gone. Summer is coming. Digi and Stacy are making plans for a wonderful vacation in Miami. Edward and his whole family are waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful vacation. And who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida for the vacation and see what's what. Digi will try to get a job and take a vacation and get to know the place. They could do it. Why? Living by the ocean surrounded by people you love and love you. Isn't that happiness?